The galaxy likes to remember the Sith as monsters, as creatures of rage, hunger, and endless ambition. But that is not how they began. Before there were empires, before there were rules, before there were names whispered in fear, there were only Jedi who no longer belonged. Not criminals, not tyrants, just Force sensitives who failed to fit inside the narrow shape the Order demanded. Some questioned too much, some loved too deeply, and some reached for power the Jedi had already decided was forbidden, and for that they were not corrected. They were removed. Exile was not announced with ceremony. It came quietly, wrapped in words like balance and discipline. Masters spoke of peace while turning their backs. Councils debated doctrine while lives were quietly erased from records. A name struck from the archives. A lightsaber taken away. A sentence passed without appeal. You are no longer one of us. For those cast out, the galaxy did not feel vast. It felt empty. They left Coruscant and other shining worlds behind, carrying nothing but memory and resentment. The Force still flowed through them, but now it had no guidance, no comfort, only questions that echoed in silence. Why was curiosity a crime? Why was passion treated as disease? Why did the Jedi preach compassion, yet show none when it mattered? The exiles wandered for years. Some died nameless on forgotten planets, and some went mad trying to silence the Force within themselves. Others clung to it desperately, afraid that without it, they would truly be nothing. And slowly, something changed. Pain sharpened perception. Fear became awareness. The dark emotions the Jedi had forbidden did not weaken them, they sustained them. Anger gave warmth in cold voids. Hatred gave direction where hope had failed. Grief gave weight to their existence. They did not choose darkness. Darkness answered when the light did not. Yet the Jedi believed they were protecting the galaxy by casting these Force users away. But in truth, they were creating something new, something hardened, something that no longer trusted ideals or mercy. Out on the edges of known space, far from Republic charts, the exiles began to find one another, not through messages or beacons, but through the Force itself. A shared scar, a familiar ache. They did not greet each other as brothers or sisters. They greeted each other as survivors. There were arguments, violence, power struggles born from years of suppression. The Jedi had taught them control through denial. Now they learned control through dominance, through endurance, through strength proven in conflict. The Force behaved differently here. It responded faster, louder. It rewarded emotion instead of silence. Where the Jedi taught calm to hear the Force, the exiles learned that intensity made it answer. Every victory reinforced the same truth. The Jedi had been wrong, and the galaxy was not balanced. It was restrained, choked by fear of what power could become if allowed to grow freely. The exiles did not yet call themselves Sith. That word had not been earned, but the foundation was already forming. A shared identity, born from rejection, shaped by pain and hardened by survival. They stopped seeing themselves as failures. They began to see themselves as the ones who endured what the Jedi could not face. And in that belief, something dangerous took root. Not ambition, not conquest, but certainty. The certainty that if the galaxy had room only for one interpretation of the Force, then that galaxy deserved to be challenged. Far away, the Jedi Order felt a disturbance they could not name, a pressure, distant and undefined. They sensed imbalance, but mistook it for noise. After all, they had removed the problem. The exiles were gone, forgotten. What the Jedi did not understand was that abandonment does not erase belief. It transforms it. In the dark, just stripped of guidance and forgiveness, the first Sith were not born as lords. They were born as a wound, and wounds, when ignored, do not fade. They deepen. They wait. They remember. Exile did not end when their ships vanished beyond Republic lanes. It only began, stretching endlessly through cold hyperspace, where destinations mattered less than survival. They followed broken star maps and half-remembered rumors, drifting toward regions the Republic ignored, because nothing profitable or safe was believed to exist there. Isolation pressed against them like gravity, heavy and unavoidable, turning days into long silences where thoughts circled endlessly, without rest or comfort at all times. Without teachers or temples, the Force felt raw and unpredictable, surging through fear and anger, responding instantly to emotion rather than discipline or restraint, control. Some tried to live quietly on frontier worlds, hiding their abilities, pretending to be ordinary beings in ordinary settlements built from rust and dust alone. But the Force never let them forget what they were, whispering during sleep, burning during danger, demanding acknowledgement through instinctive, desperate acts of survival. Always. Others gathered in small groups, drawn together by shared wounds, forming uneasy alliances that balanced cooperation with constant suspicion and restrained violence beneath fragile trust. They learned quickly that trust was dangerous, because every former Jedi carried pride, resentment, and the memory of authority stripped away by the Order itself. Food was scarce, repairs were improvised, and medical care was uncertain, forcing them to rely on the Force for endurance and healing in desperate moments. Every hardship reinforced a shared belief that the galaxy had chosen abandonment over understanding. And that choice demanded an answer someday forged in silence alone. And they pushed deeper into uncharted space, beyond familiar stars, where navigation errors meant death, and rescue was a meaningless concept spoken by nobody ever again. On forgotten worlds, they encountered cultures untouched by Jedi doctrine, societies that viewed power as survival, not moral failure, but as necessity shaped by hardship. These encounters changed them, slowly teaching that the Jedi way was not universal, only enforced where the Order held influence through fear, tradition, and authority, power. The Force responded to this realization with frightening clarity, growing stronger as they accepted emotion instead of suppressing it inside their fractured spirits, wounded hearts. Anger stopped feeling shameful. Fear became useful, and pain transformed into a guide that sharpened awareness rather than weakening resolve during long nights of travel. They marked time by stars passed and companions lost, understanding that survival itself was proof the Jedi had misjudged them completely, utterly, without mercy, once. Yet even here, far from Republic eyes, loneliness lingered, because exile is not cured by distance, only by belonging, which none of them truly felt. They spoke of returning someday, not for revenge yet, but to be seen, acknowledged, and no longer erased by the Order that abandoned them first. Hope survived quietly among them, fragile and unspoken, in coexisting with bitterness, like a faint star behind thick clouds drifting through endless night, cold, vast, silent. This was not yet an army, nor a creed, but a scattered lineage bound by rejection and the need to endure against relentless cosmic indifference. They sensed that their journey was shaping them into something unfamiliar, something the Jedi would neither recognize nor forgive when the shadows finally returned home. Every hyperspace jump carried them farther from who they were, and closer to what abandonment was teaching them about power, survival, identity, purpose, pain, darkness. The galaxy remained unaware of these wanderers, dismissing them as lost failures, unaware that pressure was quietly forging resolve within their hearts, minds, spirits, together. In exile, stripped of comfort and certainty, they began the slow transformation from rejected Jedi into something unnamed, feared later, misunderstood, hunted, remembered, whispered, remembered. And as stars blurred past their windows, the darkness did not feel like an enemy, but a shelter waiting patiently for names, purpose, vengeance, awakening. The first worlds they claimed were not conquered, but endured. Barren planets where survival demanded adaptation, patience, and unity beneath skies that offered no mercy. Here, shelters were carved from stone and wreckage, and nights taught them that warmth could come from anger as much as fire tonight, slowly always. And they studied the Force without restraint, listening to how it surged during fear, sharpened during rage, and steadied when purpose replaced doubt within their souls. Meditation became confrontation, not silence, as memories of exile surfaced, and every scarred thought was examined rather than buried with ruthless honesty, nightly together alone. Among them, leaders emerged naturally, those who endured longest, spoke least, and demonstrated control by surviving storms, beasts, and an internal collapse without complaint, fear, hesitation. Violence happened, but it taught lessons, showing that dominance required discipline, foresight, and restraint, not blind fury celebrated by myths of ancient wars, forgotten orders. They named nothing yet, avoiding titles, but rituals formed through repetition, scars, and shared victories that replaced prayers they once learned within quiet temples. Abandoned, the darkness responded with consistency, rewarding focus and intent, and answering emotion honestly, never judging motives. Only outcomes etched into survival by harsh nights, endless trials. Where the Jedi preached balance, these exiles discovered alignment, a harmony between desire and action that clarified purpose instead of denying it to themselves fully. Children were born in secrecy, raised among wrecks and stone, taught survival before morality, and strength before forgiveness ever mattered in those early years, alone. And these children sensed the Force as weather, unpredictable yet honest, shaping instincts early, making fear a guide rather than a chain during formative nights. Always. Stories of the Jedi became warnings, not legends, teaching caution toward authority, tradition, and any order demanding obedience without understanding or compassion, mercy, balance, wisdom. Over time, exile transformed into belonging, forged by shared labor, grief, and in triumphs that rewrote identity at its foundation, through endurance, memory, pain, survival, together. They stopped dreaming of return, understanding that the galaxy had moved on, and so must they, carrying lessons forward into darkness, stars, futures, unknown, ahead. Power became responsibility within their communities, measured by protection provided, not admiration gained, binding strength to duty through trials, sacrifice, patience, vigilance, loyalty, honor, resolve. Mistakes were punished swiftly, but learning followed, ensuring survival improved, and cruelty for pleasure found no lasting home among them. Ever, again, here, together, united. The Force felt closer here, intimate, responding to whispers, screams, and resolve, as if acknowledging a new path carved by suffering, choice, will, survival, endurance. They understood they were changing history simply by enduring, becoming proof that the Jedi version of destiny was incomplete and fragile, narrow, limited, flawed, wrong. Names still waited, but identity had formed, shaped by nights without stars and days without mercy, through hardship, loss, discipline, focus, patience, resilience, unity, survival. This was where darkness stopped being feared and started being trusted as a teacher that never abandoned them during trials, journeys, winters, storms, exiles. Alone. In accepting it, they unknowingly crossed a threshold the Jedi would never understand or forgive when histories converged. It returned, collided, clashed, burned, echoed, endured, forever. What began as shelter became doctrine, unwritten but lived, shaping thought, training instinct, and preparing them for confrontation with futures, enemies, memories, truths, consequences, destiny. They did not seek war yet, but they no longer feared it. Knowing survival had already demanded worse from their hearts, bodies, minds, spirits, lives. In these hidden worlds, the foundation was laid, quietly, patiently, beyond Republic's sight and Jedi sensing, across years, generations, shadows, silence, waiting, growing, enduring, unseen. Darkness became home, not because it was kind, but because it stayed when everything else left them, forever, patiently, silently, watching, teaching, shaping, waiting, remembering. They did not choose a name at first, because names attract attention, and attention had always brought judgment, exile, and loss. But the galaxy has a way of naming what it fears, and even when it does not yet understand it. Rumors began at the edges of hyperspace routes, carried by traders who vanished, pirates who fled half-mad, and settlers who abandoned entire colonies overnight. They spoke of force wielders who did not negotiate, who did not forgive, who did not ask permission. The Jedi sensed something then, faint and distant, like pressure against the Force itself. Not a presence they could see, but a distortion that refused to fade. The council debated quietly, convinced it was merely an echo of old wars, unresolved history, nothing alive anymore. They were wrong. The exiles no longer hid. They defended their worlds with certainty, not ideology. When threatened, they struck first. Not from cruelty, but from memory of abandonment and the knowledge that mercy had never saved them before. Outsiders gave them a name long before they accepted it themselves. A word drawn from ancient tongues and fearful whispers, Sith. And it was not a title of honor at first. It was an accusation. The exiles heard it spoken with trembling voices and realized something had shifted. They were no longer forgotten. They were being watched. Within their hidden communities, the name spread slowly, tested in silence. It carried weight. It carried history they did not yet know, but somehow felt familiar, as if the Force itself recognized the sound. To be Sith meant to survive without approval, to endure without forgiveness, and to draw strength from emotion instead of denying it. The children learned the word early, not as a threat, but as identity. They spoke it without fear, unaware that entire systems would one day burn at its mention. For them, It meant belonging. The Jedi archives would later describe this moment as corruption, as the birth of evil, as the point where darkness took form. But that is not how it felt to those who lived it. For them, the name was a scar finally acknowledged, a wound that no longer needed to hide. The Sith did not declare war. They did not announce themselves to the Republic. They simply existed, fully and unapologetically, in defiance of a galaxy that had tried to erase them. And existence, for the Sith, was already an act of rebellion. Far away, the Jedi Order tightened its doctrines, sensing the Force slipping beyond familiar boundaries. They spoke of vigilance, of ancient dangers returning. Yet none could say when it began, and because the truth was uncomfortable. It began the moment compassion failed. The Sith did not rise from ambition or hunger for power. They rose from abandonment, from silence, from being told there was no place for them in the light. By the time the galaxy learned to fear the name, it was already too late. The foundation had been laid. The identity had formed. The wound had learned how to walk. This was not the beginning of a war. It was the beginning of memory. And memory, once awakened, and does not fade. The Red World did not welcome them with kindness. It answered them with heat, storms, and skies stained like old wounds that never healed. Korriban was not discovered by chance. It was felt. Those who arrived there sensed the Force differently, heavy and ancient, pressing against the mind like memory older than language. The ground itself seemed aware, as if it had been waiting for them long before their ships cut through its atmosphere. So this was not a refuge meant to comfort. It was a world meant to test. The exiles stepped onto its surface and felt something settle inside them. A quiet certainty that exile had finally ended. They had not found safety. They had found alignment. The darkness here did not resist them. It recognized them. Korriban was already home to a people who understood power without apology. The Sith species lived by strength, ritual, and survival, and shaped by a world that rewarded dominance and punished weakness without mercy. They did not fear the Force. They revered it as inheritance. The meeting was not peaceful, nor was it immediately violent. The exiles were outsiders, pale and scarred by space, carrying knowledge the Sith species did not possess. In return, the native Sith carried traditions older than Republic history, bound to bloodlines and belief. Suspicion filled the air like ash. Conflict came first. Force met blade. Ritual met instinct. The exiles prevailed, not because they were crueler, but because they had learned to survive loss. They had already been broken once. Korriban could not break them again. What followed was not conquest, but fusion. The Sith species did not submit easily, but they understood power when they saw it. The exiles did not erase them. They absorbed their customs, their language, their rights. In turn, the Sith species accepted these Force wielders as leaders, teachers, and a living proof that strength could evolve. This was the true birth of Sith civilization. Not a moment of coronation, but a slow merging of belief and ability. The exiles became rulers, not through claim, but through demonstration. They built no shining cities. They carved monuments into stone, into mountains, into the bones of the planet itself. Temples rose not for beauty, but for permanence. Here, power was studied openly. The Force was no longer divided into permitted and forbidden, and it was explored, refined, tested through ritual and endurance. Knowledge became currency. Bloodlines became legacy. Children were no longer raised to fear emotion. They were taught to master it. Anger was sharpened. Fear was harnessed. Desire was disciplined, not denied. The first Sith Lords emerged without ceremony, their authority accepted because resistance proved fatal. These rulers were not monsters yet. They were kings, priests, and warlords who believed they were building something eternal. And for a time, they were right. The Sith Empire grew slowly, unseen by the Republic, untouched by Jedi awareness. Its strength was internal, rooted in belief that power should be earned and preserved within those strong enough to hold it. But beneath the order, something restless moved. The Force rewarded ambition generously on Korriban. It also punished restraint. Every lesson learned pushed the Sith Lords toward greater power, so deeper rituals, harsher trials. Hunger grew alongside mastery. No one spoke of betrayal yet, but the Red Sands remembered every footstep, every grave, every oath sworn in fire. Korriban had answered them, and in doing so, it began teaching the Sith a lesson they would learn again and again. Power never stays still. The first thrones were not built in halls, but in silence, where victory was measured by who still stood breathing. So leadership among the Sith did not pass through ceremony or inheritance alone. It was proven again and again through survival. As the Empire grew, order followed strength. Those who could command the Force most completely gathered followers. Those who hesitated were replaced. Power decided hierarchy, and hierarchy decided fate. The Sith Lords ruled as kings, but their crowns were invisible. Authority came from fear sharpened by respect, and respect lasted only as long as dominance remained unquestioned. Every command carried the weight of challenge because obedience was never guaranteed. Bloodlines began to matter. Children born to powerful Sith were trained early, watched closely, pushed harder than others. They were told stories not of mercy, but of legacy. To fail was not shameful. To fail and survive was unacceptable. Rituals bound families together and tore rivals apart. Marriages were alliances, and offspring were investments. Betrayal was not forbidden. It was expected, prepared for, and often encouraged as proof of worth. Within the temples, knowledge was guarded like a weapon. Sith Lords hoarded teachings, sharing only fragments with apprentices to ensure dependence. Every lesson was incomplete by design. Every truth was layered with omission. This created stability, and it created paranoia. No Sith Lord slept without guards. No council met without hidden blades and unspoken threats. Untrust existed only briefly, and only when ambition aligned. The Empire functioned not because of unity, but because fear kept everything from collapsing at once. For a time, it worked. The Sith expanded beyond Korriban, claiming worlds through conquest and submission. Their banners were not symbols of justice or peace, but of inevitability. Resistance ended quickly. Compliance brought survival. To the Sith, this was balance. So they believed the galaxy should be ruled by those strong enough to shape it. Weakness was not a crime, but it was not protected. Compassion existed, but only within loyalty. Mercy was selective, strategic, and temporary. The Jedi would later call this cruelty. The Sith called it honesty. Yet beneath the structure, ambition grew sharper. Sith Lords pushed rituals further, seeking immortality, dominion, and transcendence. The Force answered, but always with a price. Bodies weakened, to minds fractured, rivalries intensified. Every throne created an enemy. Every victory planted a future rebellion. Apprentices watched their masters closely, learning not just power, but timing. When to kneel, when to strike, when to let rivals destroy each other before moving. This was the hidden curriculum of the Sith. The Empire became powerful but unstable. Generations of Sith Lords rose and fell, each believing they would be the one to end the cycle. None succeeded. Some of the very system that elevated them ensured their downfall. Still, the Sith believed they were evolving. They built monuments, codified laws, refined rituals. They recorded victories and erased failures. History became propaganda, shaped by whoever survived to write it. But the Red Worlds remembered everything. Beneath temples and tombs, the Force churned, heavy with unspent violence and unresolved ambition. The Sith had built a civilization, but they had also built a pressure that could not be released. No one spoke openly of collapse. But every Sith Lord understood it privately. Power gained through blood always demands more blood in return. And the thrones, no matter how secure they seemed, were already cracking beneath the weight of those who sat upon them. The temples rose slowly, carved into stone by hands that trembled with devotion, fear, and ambition, each cut binding belief into the bones of Korriban. And they were not places of worship alone, but furnaces of identity, where Sith learned who they were meant to become through ritual, pain, silence, endurance. Fire burned constantly within these halls, not for warmth, but as reminder that power must be fed, or it dies without mercy, restraint, hesitation, forgiveness. Ritual defined daily life, from awakening to rest, shaping discipline through repetition, punishment, and reward, measured only by survival within temple walls, nights of trial. And initiates were tested harshly, forced to confront fear openly, learning that hesitation invited death faster than any external enemy lurking beyond. Walls, shadows, storms, stars. Pain was instruction, failure was lesson, and survival was proof of worth within a system that never apologized to anyone, ever, regardless of reason, mercy. Within these temples, Sith philosophy hardened, teaching that power demanded commitment, secrecy, and then the willingness to sacrifice everything else without regret, doubt, remorse, pause, exception. The Force responded violently here, amplifying emotion, rewarding obsession, and punishing restraint with stagnation and decay across minds, bodies, bloodlines, generations, memories, dreams, fears, futures. Temples became laboratories of belief, where Sith experimented with domination, alchemy, and endurance beyond Jedi comprehension. Through fire, sacrifice, blood, trials, isolation, secrecy, and obsession, devotion. Knowledge was sacred yet dangerous, guarded jealously, parceled selectively, ensuring dependence while fueling rivalry between masters and apprentices across generations, lineages, temples, orders, shadows, eternity. Every lesson carried risk, because understanding invited challenge, and challenge was the true currency of advancement among Sith, lords, students, rivals, allies, enemies, observers, alike. The temples recorded history selectively, honoring victors while erasing failures, creating a lineage remembered only by the living within stone, fire, ash, whispers, scars, echoes. Architecture itself enforced obedience, towering corridors, humbling the weak and elevating those who endured their oppressive scale through silence, shadow, pressure, time, ritual, memory, fear. Firelight revealed nothing gently, casting harsh shadows that reminded all present of impermanence and constant threat within sacred halls, chanting, storms, to nights, rituals, trials, deaths. Sith lords presided here, not as gods, but as survivors guarding systems that kept them powerful through fear, order, secrecy, discipline, vigilance, violence, balance, survival. Yet fear seeped into the stone because power gained within these temples demanded constant defense from rivals, apprentices, allies, time, decay, ambition, memory, destiny, inevitability. Every rite strengthened the empire while weakening trust, shall planting seeds that would one day tear everything apart across bloodlines, generations, thrones, worlds, futures, histories, forever. The Jedi, distant and unaware, could not hear these rituals, but the Force remembered every echo, buried beneath stone, fire, blood, silence, time, space, darkness. Here, the Sith learned permanence was illusion, maintained only through vigilance and endless assertion of dominance against rivals. Decay, betrayal, weakness, doubt, fear, erosion, entropy, and temples became hearts of an empire that beat unevenly, powerful yet unstable, disciplined yet constantly threatened by ambition, rivalry, hunger, excess, memory, prophecy, silence, time. Those who endured their trials emerged changed, convinced strength justified rule and fear ensured peace within Sith, realms, temples, cultures, traditions, histories, legacies, shadows, eternity. No voice questioned this belief openly, because temples taught that doubt was weakness, deserving punishment through pain, exile, humiliation, loss, erasure, silence, fear, suffering, obedience. Thus, the Sith Empire solidified inwardly, strong in ritual, fractured in trust, marching toward inevitable collapse across centuries. Wars, reigns, thrones, bloodlines, memories, echoes, time. The temples had done their work, shaping kings who would devour each other without mercy through ambition, ritual, fear, tradition, silence, doctrine, an inheritance, expectation, destiny. And beneath Korriban's sands, the Force waited, patient, knowing these fires would one day spread beyond temples, empires, worlds, histories, memories, stars, silence, time, destiny. Power did not destroy the Sith from outside. It turned inward, slowly, patiently, like a blade guided by familiarity rather than hatred. As the Empire matured, the greatest threat to any Sith Lord was no longer the Jedi or the Republic, but those who stood closest. As rivals shared temples, apprentices shared chambers, allies shared secrets that could become weapons without warning. Victory stopped being enough. Every Sith Lord wanted certainty that their rule would never end. They searched the Force for permanence, for rituals that could lock power in place, for methods to escape decay, age, and betrayal itself. The Force answered them, as it always did, but never kindly. Some sought immortality through essence transfer, binding will to flesh and stone, and others turned to alchemy, reshaping bodies until strength outpaced humanity. A few attempted to dominate death itself, believing fear could be conquered like any rival. Each experiment cost something. Sanity frayed, bodies failed, trust collapsed. Sith philosophy began to fracture under its own success. The belief that power justified rule had built an empire. Now it demanded escalation. If strength granted authority, then greater strength demanded absolute control. Paranoia became discipline, and Sith Lords withdrew into isolation, surrounding themselves with guards and wards, convinced betrayal was inevitable. Apprentices were trained harshly, not to succeed, but to be tested. Survival mattered more than loyalty. Every lesson became a trap. Masters withheld knowledge to prevent overthrow. Apprentices pushed limits to expose weakness. Both sides believed they were preparing for the future. Both were sharpening knives. The empire still expanded, but its growth was uneven. So worlds were claimed and abandoned. Campaigns succeeded and collapsed. Victories felt hollow because no Sith Lord could enjoy them without fear of replacement. Councils dissolved into bloodshed. Dynasties ended overnight. The Sith did not notice the pattern at first because it felt like progress. The weak were removed. The strong remained. This was the law they believed in. This was the system they trusted. But the Force was changing. Where it once responded with clarity, it now answered with hunger. Power demanded more power to sustain itself. Rituals grew darker, more extreme, feeding on sacrifice rather than discipline. The line between mastery and addiction blurred. Some Sith Lords recognized the danger. They spoke cautiously of restraint, of structure, of preserving the empire rather than devouring it. These voices were silenced quickly. Caution was mistaken for weakness. Stability was mistaken for fear. The Sith had no language for limits, and so the cycle continued. Empires rose and shattered. Lords ascended and fell. Knowledge was lost as often as it was gained, buried beneath collapsed temples and erased lineages. Every generation believed it would succeed where the last had failed. None did. What the Sith never understood was simple. Power taken through domination cannot rest. It must always be defended. It must always be proven. By the time the Jedi finally encountered the Sith openly, so they did not face a unified civilization. They faced fragments, competing empires, warring philosophies, lords who hated each other more than any external enemy. The Sith were still powerful, but they were already broken. Korriban watched silently as its kings turned on themselves, its temples filled with ghosts of ambition. The Red Sands drank blood without judgment, having seen this cycle before. Power had answered the Sith, and then it had turned inward. The Jedi did not sense the Sith because they were looking for them. They sensed them because the Force itself began to strain under what was growing unseen. For centuries, the Jedi believed the dark side had retreated into myth. Ancient wars were studied as warnings, not expectations. The Order focused inward, refining doctrine, expanding influence, trusting that vigilance alone was enough to keep the galaxy stable. But the Force does not stay quiet forever. Across distant sectors, subtle disruptions appeared. Not screams, not violence, just absence. Worlds where the Force felt heavy, resistant, as if something vast was pressing back when Jedi minds reached outward in meditation. Masters dismissed it as imbalance left behind by forgotten conflicts. Padawans felt it first. They spoke of unease during training, of visions that did not align with teachings. Red skies, stone temples, figures that did not hide from the dark, but stood comfortably within it. These reports were noted, archived, and quietly ignored. The Jedi had learned to distrust fear. What they did not understand was that fear was no longer hiding. As generations passed, disturbances became patterns. Trade routes went silent. Exploration vessels vanished without distress calls. Republic envoys failed to return from outer territories. Nothing dramatic enough to demand war, but enough to unsettle those who paid attention. The council debated carefully. Some argued the galaxy was simply too large to police completely. Others warned that something ancient might be stirring. The name Sith was spoken rarely, and when it was, it carried disbelief more than concern. That threat, they believed, had destroyed itself long ago. They were only half right. The Sith were no longer a single empire. They were not unified, not stable, not openly hostile. But they were alive, and survival had sharpened them into something difficult to detect. The Force began to feel crowded. Jedi who traveled far from Republic space described resistance during meditation, as if another will pushed back against their presence. Not chaotic, not wild, focused, intentional. This was not the dark side flaring. This was the dark side organized. The realization came slowly, painfully. They were not alone. The Jedi did not announce this discovery to the Republic. Knowledge like this demanded certainty. They sent scouts instead, quiet missions, small groups, masters who could observe without provoking. Those scouts never returned. When the truth could no longer be denied, the Council faced a decision they had hoped never to make again. Whatever existed beyond the known maps was not fading. It was growing. And if left untouched, it would one day challenge everything the Jedi believed they protected. They chose intervention, not conquest, not negotiation. Containment. The Jedi believed they were acting with restraint. They prepared as guardians, not executioners. Lightsabers were carried as symbols of authority, not instruments of genocide. They told themselves this mission was about balance. But balance looks different to those who have already been erased once. When Jedi ships finally crossed into Sith-controlled space, the Force reacted violently. Not in shock, but recognition. Ancient rivalries stirred. Old wounds reopened. And the Sith felt it instantly, like pressure on the mind that no meditation could silence. They knew what was coming. The Jedi arrived expecting ruins. They found civilizations, temples, armies, lords who did not flee or plead, but watched calmly as strangers from the light stepped into worlds shaped by darkness. The Sith did not introduce themselves. They did not explain their history. They remembered how that had ended before. The moment the Jedi realized the Sith had endured, and everything changed. Diplomacy became impossible, because neither side trusted mercy from the other. Fear replaced curiosity. Memory replaced patience. The disturbance the Jedi could not ignore was no longer distant. It was standing in front of them. And both sides understood, without speaking, that whatever happened next would not end quietly. The first encounter did not begin with fire or shouting. It began with stillness, heavy and deliberate, as two ancient beliefs stood close enough to feel each other breathe through the Force. The Jedi arrived expecting hostility. They carried calm faces and careful words, believing control itself could prevent what history warned them was inevitable. Their posture was open, their lightsabers unlit, their presence shaped to signal authority without threat. The Sith watched without surprise. They had felt this moment approaching for years, sensed it growing closer with every ripple in the Force. And the arrival of the Jedi did not feel like discovery. It felt like memory returning to finish what it had started long ago. Words were exchanged. The Jedi spoke of balance, of harmony, of restoring order to a galaxy that did not yet know it was in danger. They spoke as guardians, not conquerors, convinced that clarity and restraint would be enough to contain what stood before them. The Sith heard something else. They heard judgment wearing calm tones. They heard exile hidden inside polite concern. They heard the same certainty that had once stripped them of names, of homes, of belonging. No one knelt. The force tightened between them, responding to unspoken history rather than present intention. It pressed outward, heavy with unresolved violence, with ancient resentment that no language could soften anymore. Negotiation failed without anyone raising their voice. Both sides understood the truth too clearly. Now the Jedi could not allow the Sith to exist unchecked. The Sith could not trust mercy from those who had already erased them once. Survival, not ideology, made the choice for them. When the first lightsaber ignited, it felt less like an attack and more like permission finally granted. Combat spread with terrifying speed. Jedi training emphasized precision, restraint, and control. Sith combat answered with intensity, unpredictability, and emotion sharpened into instinct. The Force flared violently, no longer contained by doctrine on either side. This was not a duel, it was collision. The Jedi realized too late that the Sith were not scattered cultists or broken survivors. They were trained, organized, hardened by centuries of internal conflict. Every Sith strike carried experience forged by betrayal and survival, not theory. The Sith learned something as well. The Jedi were stronger than expected, disciplined, united. Their calm did not mean hesitation, and it meant focus sharpened through generations of shared belief. The battlefield became confusion. Victory shifted back and forth, claimed and lost in moments. No side celebrated, no side retreated. Every fallen warrior deepened resolve rather than weakening it. Each death confirmed what both orders already knew. There could be no coexistence. When the Jedi withdrew, it was not defeat, it was recognition. They had not come to negotiate peace. They had come to confirm a threat. And that confirmation had been made undeniable. The Sith did not pursue. They watched the Jedi depart in silence, understanding that something irreversible had occurred. They had been seen, named, acknowledged by the light not as rumor, but as enemy. From that moment forward, survival required preparation. The Jedi returned to their councils with heavy silence, carrying knowledge they could not soften for the Republic. The Sith gathered their lords and warriors, for no longer pretending isolation would protect them. The galaxy had shifted. First contact had been made, and there would be no return to secrecy again. War did not arrive with celebration or righteous fury. It arrived quietly, carried by inevitability, settling over both orders like a sentence already passed. The Jedi did not declare crusade. They framed their actions as necessity, as protection, as balance restored through intervention. Fleets moved without banners. Armies advanced without speeches. The Republic was told little because truth carried panic, and panic threatened order. The Sith understood this kind of war immediately. It was not fought for territory or glory. It was fought for erasure. Jedi strike teams targeted temples first, not populations. Knowledge was the true enemy. Archives were burned. Holocrons were seized or destroyed. Sith Lords were hunted not as rulers, but as infections that had to be removed completely. And the Sith answered with brutality sharpened by memory. They did not seek open battle unless forced. They ambushed supply lines. They lured Jedi into worlds heavy with dark side influence, where discipline faltered and hesitation proved fatal. Every victory was temporary. Every loss taught adaptation. No battle felt decisive. Worlds changed hands only to be abandoned. Strongholds fell only to rise again elsewhere. Both sides learned that destroying bodies meant little if belief endured. So the Force itself became a battlefield, pulled and twisted by opposing wills that refused surrender. The Jedi began to lose something they did not expect: certainty. They had trained for conflict against darkness, but not against an enemy that understood them so well. Sith tactics mirrored Jedi discipline in distorted reflection. Where Jedi trusted restraint, Sith exploited predictability. Where Jedi valued unity, Sith targeted emotional bonds. Apprentices were captured, masters were isolated. Victories tasted hollow, because each success carried loss that could not be reconciled through doctrine. The Sith lost even more. They lost lords whose knowledge had shaped generations. They lost bloodlines cultivated for centuries. Entire traditions vanished overnight, erased by precise Jedi intervention. Each loss weakened their internal balance, forcing reliance on fewer, more extreme survivors. The war fed on extremes. Jedi were pushed toward harsher decisions, and justifying them as lesser evils. Sith embraced greater risks, believing survival demanded escalation. The Force responded violently, swelling with pain, fear, and unresolved grief that lingered long after battles ended. Neither side called this triumph. There were no parades, no closure, only exhaustion. The Sith realized something painful but clarifying. They could not win through dominance. Their numbers were limited. Their unity was fragile. Every open confrontation invited annihilation. And the Jedi realized something equally troubling. Total victory would demand destruction on a scale that contradicted everything they claimed to protect. To end the Sith completely, they would have to become something unrecognizable. So the war dragged on. Years blurred together. Battles were remembered by scars rather than names. The Republic sensed unrest but never understood its cause. History fractured, recorded differently depending on who survived long enough to write it. When the fighting slowed, it did not end. It simply changed shape. The Sith withdrew deeper into obscurity, abandoning worlds rather than defending them. Survival replaced conquest entirely. The Jedi tightened surveillance, mistaking retreat for weakness, unaware that desperation was teaching the Sith restraint. No one emerged victorious. The Jedi carried guilt they would not name. The Sith carried hatred refined into patience. Both orders were scarred in ways no doctrine could heal. The war had answered nothing. It had only proven that neither side could destroy the other without destroying itself. And in that realization, the Sith began to understand that survival would require something far more dangerous than strength. It would require adaptation. Survival was no longer instinct. It became belief, refined through loss, failure, and the slow understanding that open power invited extinction. The Sith gathered what remained of their lords, not in triumph, but in silence heavy with memory. The war had stripped illusion from them. Empires had fallen. Temples had burned. Strength alone had proven insufficient against an enemy that never tired of hunting. From this truth, doctrine was born. The Sith abandoned permanence. No more fixed capitals. No more monuments meant to last forever. Everything that could be found could be destroyed, and so they learned to leave nothing behind that mattered. Knowledge became hidden, fragmented, scattered across worlds and minds. Teachings were divided, passed down selectively, so that no single defeat could erase everything again. Loss was planned for. Death was expected. The Sith stopped fighting wars. They studied patience. They learned that the Jedi trusted patterns, councils, and visibility. So the Sith became irregular, unpredictable, and rare. They dissolved their armies and elevated individuals. Masters trained apprentices not as successors to rule, but as weapons to outlast time. Power was no longer displayed, it was concealed. Rituals changed. Instead of grand ceremonies, Sith teachings focused on efficiency, secrecy, and endurance. Emotion was still embraced, but now it was controlled with purpose. Rage became fuel, not fire. Fear became awareness, not panic. The Sith accepted that they would always be fewer, and in that acceptance they found clarity. They studied the Jedi as carefully as the Jedi studied them. Every weakness was noted, every contradiction observed. The Sith saw how mercy could be manipulated, how compassion slowed response, how attachment created hesitation. The light could not always overcome. Survival demanded restraint, not weakness. The Sith erased their own histories deliberately, allowing myths to replace truth. Let the galaxy believe they were dead. Let the Jedi grow comfortable with absence. Let time do the work that armies could not. This was not surrender. It was strategy born from extinction. As some Sith resisted this change, they clung to visions of conquest, of restored empires and open rule. These Sith did not last. They drew attention. They attracted Jedi blades. Their deaths reinforced the lesson. Only those who adapted survived. The Sith stopped measuring success by territory or fear. Success became continuity. If even one Sith endured, the Order endured. If knowledge survived in fragments, it could be rebuilt. They learned to think in centuries. And the Jedi mistook silence for victory. The Republic recorded the Sith as defeated threats, remnants of a darker age that had burned itself out through excess and cruelty. In truth, the Sith were learning something far more dangerous. They were learning how to wait. By the time the war truly ended, there were no treaties, no declarations, only absence. Jedi patrols found empty worlds and ruined temples. The Sith were gone, not destroyed, but withdrawn beyond easy reach. So survival had become their highest law. Not glory, not dominance, endurance. And in that quiet shift, unnoticed by the galaxy, the Sith began laying the groundwork for a future the Jedi could not imagine yet. A future where power would not shout. It would whisper. Victory did not bring relief to the Sith. It brought silence, and silence allowed doubt to speak. Each lord who survived the wars believed survival itself was proof of worth. They told themselves they had endured where others failed, that the Force had chosen them to remain. But the Sith had learned, through generations of blood, that survival was never permanent. Power attracted attention. Every victory placed a Sith Lord beneath unseen eyes. She was watched by rivals who measured strength not to admire it, but to test its limits. Allies smiled while calculating distance. Apprentices bowed while memorizing patterns, habits. Moments of weakness hidden beneath authority. Trust became dangerous. The Sith had built their civilization on the belief that strength should rule. Now that belief began to turn against itself. If strength justified authority, then greater strength demanded replacement. Every throne was an invitation, and lords withdrew from one another, sealing themselves behind wards and guards, convinced betrayal would come from within rather than without. Councils met less often. Decisions were delayed. Fear settled into daily life, unspoken but constant. The Force reflected this change. Where once it had answered with clarity, it now felt restless, agitated by suspicion and unexpressed intent. Power no longer flowed freely. It resisted, shone as if waiting for conflict to resolve itself through violence rather than patience. Sith Lords began to hoard knowledge more aggressively. Teachings were divided into fragments. Rituals were altered, then hidden. Apprentices were denied full understanding, trained just enough to serve, never enough to surpass. Masters told themselves this was wisdom. In truth, it was fear. Victory over the Jedi had not unified the Sith. It had removed their common enemy. Without the pressure of survival against an external threat, the Sith turned inward. Rivalries that had been restrained by necessity now grew unchecked. Old grudges resurfaced. Debts were remembered. Insults that once seemed minor gained weight. Every gathering felt temporary. Every alliance felt conditional. Some Sith Lords attempted reform. They spoke of stability, of cooperation, of preserving what had been built. These voices were heard politely, then ignored. Stability threatened ambition. Cooperation threatened hierarchy. The Sith respected results, not intentions. As decades passed, victories became personal rather than collective. Lords expanded influence quietly, claiming resources, apprentices, and territory without open conflict. Each move was measured, designed to weaken rivals without drawing attention. But attention always followed power. The first betrayals came quietly. An apprentice disappeared during a mission. A lord failed to return from meditation. A stronghold fell silent without explanation. These events were discussed cautiously, attributed to accidents or external threats, because the alternative was too dangerous to acknowledge. The Sith had no mechanism for peace. Their laws rewarded dominance, not harmony. Their philosophy celebrated ambition, not restraint. Suspicion was not discouraged. It was cultivated as awareness. Victory had created a system that could not rest. Each Sith Lord believed collapse would happen, but never to them. They trusted their own vigilance, their own preparation, their own strength. The mistakes of others were studied carefully, not to prevent repetition, but to ensure advantage. The Force grew heavier with every unspoken intent. Dark side energies pooled around places of power, amplifying paranoia and obsession. Visions became distorted, showing futures shaped by betrayal and loss. Sith interpreted these visions as warnings, but never as lessons. Shown to act first felt safer than waiting. The cycle began slowly, almost invisibly. A lord struck to prevent imagined betrayal. An apprentice challenged to escape suppression. An ally turned enemy to secure advantage. Each act was justified. Each act made the next inevitable. Victory had taught the Sith they could survive anything. What it had not taught them was how to survive each other. And in that failure, the foundations of every Sith empire began to crack, quietly, patiently, from within. And apprentices were taught to listen more than they spoke, to observe more than they acted. In silence, they learned the true language of the Sith. From the moment an apprentice was chosen, trust was already broken. Selection was not an act of faith, it was an act of calculation. Masters did not seek loyalty. They sought potential, sharpened enough to be useful, restrained enough to be controlled. Every lesson carried two meanings, one spoken, one hidden. So apprentices were trained to sense weakness, not only in enemies, but in their own masters. They were encouraged to question, to doubt, to push against limits, because stagnation was considered a form of death. Yet every challenge was dangerous. Push too soon, and punishment followed. Wait too long, and replacement was inevitable. This tension defined their existence. Masters withheld knowledge deliberately. Rituals were taught in fragments. Histories were altered, and truth was shaped to serve authority. Apprentices were told this was preparation. In reality, it was fear disguised as wisdom. But apprentices noticed patterns. They saw how power changed their masters. how paranoia grew with age, how isolation replaced confidence, how every Sith Lord, no matter how strong, eventually began guarding knowledge instead of expanding it. From this, apprentices learned their most important lesson. Power does not want to be shared. They studied their masters closely, and not just techniques, but habits, moments of exhaustion, rituals that left them vulnerable, emotions that clouded judgment. Every detail became data stored quietly for later use. The Sith did not forbid betrayal. They rewarded it. Apprentices were taught that one day they must challenge their masters, not out of hatred, but necessity. A Sith who could not defend their position did not deserve it. This belief was repeated so often, it became unquestioned truth. Yet timing was everything. An apprentice who struck too early revealed impatience. One who waited too long revealed fear. Both outcomes were fatal. Survival depended on reading the moment perfectly, on understanding when ambition aligned with opportunity. Some apprentices never reached that moment. They were tested harshly, pushed into battles meant to measure resolve. Many died anonymously, erased from memory without ceremony. Their failures became warnings, unspoken but understood. Those who survived grew colder. Emotion remained their strength, but it was disciplined, focused, sharpened by observation rather than impulse. They learned to mask intent behind obedience, to perform loyalty convincingly, to let their masters believe control still existed. This illusion sustained entire empires. Masters believed they were shaping successors. Apprentices knew they were sharpening replacements. The relationship was symbiotic and doomed, bound by mutual understanding, neither side acknowledged openly. And the Force reflected this imbalance. Dark side energies responded strongly to ambition and resentment, amplifying visions of dominance and triumph. Apprentices dreamed of futures where they stood alone, unchallenged. Masters dreamed of betrayal they could never fully prevent. Every dream fed suspicion. As generations passed, apprentices became more skilled at deception than domination. They learned patience instead of open defiance. They learned that the most effective strike was unseen, and delivered when a master felt most secure. Some Sith Lords attempted to break the cycle. They trained multiple apprentices, believing rivalry would keep them safe. Instead, it hastened collapse. Apprentices allied briefly, then turned on each other, ensuring only the most ruthless survived. Others attempted to rule without apprentices at all. These Sith did not last. Isolation weakened them. Without a challenger, stagnation set in. The Force responded poorly to complacency. Power faded. Rivals sensed weakness and moved in. The system corrected itself. Apprentices who learned too well did not see themselves as traitors. They saw themselves as inevitability, the next step in a philosophy that demanded replacement as proof of progress. They did not ask if the cycle should end. They asked only when it would be their turn. And with each successful betrayal, the Sith grew stronger individually and weaker collectively, unaware that their greatest enemy was no longer the Jedi. And it was the lesson they taught their children. Empires did not fall in firestorms or final battles. They collapsed quietly, eaten from the inside by ambition that no longer needed an enemy. Sith dominions rose around powerful lords, built through fear, discipline, and temporary loyalty. For a time, these empires felt stable. Order existed. Chains of command were respected. Rivals were kept at bay through strength alone. But stability was always an illusion. Every empire depended on a single truth the Sith refused to confront. Power concentrated in one being invites hunger in everyone else. The greater a lord's authority became, the more valuable their death appeared to those watching closely. Apprentices grew restless as empires expanded. Victory removed urgency. Campaigns ended. Enemies vanished. And in peace, ambition had nowhere to go except inward. Lords responded by tightening control. They increased surveillance, restricted access to knowledge, isolated themselves behind guards and wards. These measures felt necessary, but each one widened the distance between ruler and ruled. Fear replaced loyalty. Silence replaced confidence. The Force reacted accordingly. Dark side energies intensified around seats of power, amplifying paranoia and obsession. Visions grew darker, futures fractured. Sith Lords interpreted these warnings as threats from others, never as reflections of themselves. Small rebellions began unnoticed. A regional governor withheld tribute. A lesser lord delayed responding to summons. An apprentice questioned an order just once too often. Each act was minor alone. Together, they signaled decay. Empires fractured into factions. Lords fought proxy wars through servants and disciples, avoiding open conflict until advantage was assured. Worlds were destabilized deliberately. Resources were sabotaged. Alliances shifted constantly, and dissolving as soon as they threatened dominance. The Sith called this competition. In reality, it was erosion. As conflicts multiplied, knowledge was lost. Temples were destroyed not by Jedi, but by rival Sith seeking advantage. Holocrons shattered. Rituals vanished. Entire schools of thought disappeared overnight, taking centuries of learning with them. No one mourned. Loss was accepted as the cost of progress. Empires that once spanned systems collapsed into scattered enclaves, and strongholds became tombs. Lords were overthrown by apprentices who inherited authority they could not hold for long. The cycle accelerated. Each collapse hardened the survivors. They learned to rule briefly, to take what they could before inevitable betrayal. Long reigns became rare. Longevity became suspicious. Any Sith who ruled too long was assumed to be vulnerable. This belief became self-fulfilling. The Force grew unstable around these ruins, saturated with unspent rage and ambition, and it responded powerfully to those who entered, rewarding aggression and punishing restraint. New lords rose quickly, burned brightly, and vanished just as fast. The Jedi watched from a distance, misreading the pattern. They believed the Sith were destroying themselves, that time was completing what war had begun. They recorded each fallen empire as proof that darkness could not sustain order. They did not see what was being forged. Every collapse refined the Sith. Each failure removed weakness. Knowledge survived in fragments, scattered across survivors who adapted faster with every generation. What was lost in unity was gained in resilience. Empires collapsing from within did not weaken the Sith's hatred. They distilled it. By the time the galaxy believed the Sith were finished, the truth was more dangerous. The Sith no longer needed empires. They no longer trusted them. They were learning that the most enduring power was not held together. It was hidden. The Sith did not need enemies to fall apart. They had perfected destruction long before the Jedi ever returned. By the time the last great empires collapsed, the pattern was undeniable. Every Sith Lord rose believing they would be different. Every reign ended the same way, not through invasion, but through betrayal sharpened by familiarity. Rivals were closest allies. Allies were future executioners. The Sith had built a philosophy that rewarded domination, suspicion, and ambition without limit. In doing so, they removed the need for external opposition. Conflict was guaranteed because survival demanded it. Trust was considered weakness. Mercy was treated as hesitation. Stability was mistaken for decay. Sith Lords no longer feared the Jedi as their primary threat. Jedi attacks were predictable, bound by rules and restraint. A rival Sith was not. A rival Sith understood ambition intimately and would strike without warning or regret. And every gathering carried tension. Councils became arenas where words replaced blades only temporarily. Agreements were layered with deception. Oaths were spoken, knowing they would be broken. Each Sith assumed betrayal was inevitable and planned accordingly. This awareness did not prevent collapse. It ensured it. Apprentices rose faster, challenging earlier, unwilling to wait decades for opportunity. Masters responded with harsher control, accelerating resentment. The cycle shortened. As reigns grew briefer, violence became constant. The Sith believed this proved strength. In truth, it proved imbalance. Without enemies, the Sith turned every achievement into a threat. Success painted targets. Power isolated its holder. The stronger a Sith became, the more urgently others moved to remove them. Entire orders vanished overnight. A temple might fall without any record of battle. A lineage could end in a single evening, erased by poison, sabotage, or ritual assassination. These acts were not condemned. They were studied. Lessons were extracted. The Force itself seemed complicit, amplifying ambition and rewarding decisive cruelty. Visions favored those willing to act first. Hesitation was punished. Reflection was dangerous. The Sith mistook this for approval. They did not realize the dark side was feeding on collapse, not order. Some Sith recognized the truth too late. They saw that endless internal war weakened everything it touched, and they understood that an order devouring itself could not endure forever, no matter how ruthless its survivors became. These Sith were destroyed quickly. The system allowed no dissent. Questioning the cycle marked one as weak, hesitant, unworthy of survival. Reform was interpreted as fear. Fear invited challenge. And so the Sith continued. They did not need Jedi crusades to shatter their civilizations. They did not need Republic fleets to burn their worlds. They needed only time, ambition, and proximity. The galaxy observed fragments and assumed extinction. What it did not see was evolution. Each collapse stripped away excess. Each betrayal refined patience. Each failure taught the same lesson, repeated until it could no longer be ignored. Open power invites annihilation. Visible empires attract enemies. Strength must be concealed to survive. The Sith had consumed themselves until only the most adaptable remained. These survivors carried hatred distilled by centuries of loss. They no longer dreamed of thrones or banners. They dreamed of endurance. In destroying one another, the Sith unknowingly prepared for their next transformation. A future where power would no longer shout through empires, but endure through secrecy. The Sith did not need enemies. They had already become their own. He did not rise from victory. He rose from the aftermath of failure. The galaxy around him was littered with the remains of Sith ambition. Ruined temples, silent worlds, names remembered only by broken holocrons and half-burned records. Empires had risen with confidence and collapsed with certainty, leaving nothing behind but echoes of the same mistake repeated endlessly. He saw the pattern clearly. Where others saw betrayal, he saw inevitability. And where others blamed weakness, he saw design. The Sith had not been defeated by the Jedi. They had not been erased by the Republic. They had been undone by their own nature, by a philosophy that rewarded hunger without limit. He had lived through the end of empires. He had watched lords destroy rivals instead of enemies. He had felt the force grow thinner with every internal war, less focused, less disciplined, spread across too many hands that demanded everything and mastered nothing. The Sith were powerful, but they were inefficient. This realization did not come to him in a single moment. It grew slowly, through observation and survival. He learned by enduring what others could not, by outliving those who sought dominance instead of control, by watching strength dissolve into chaos every time the Sith grew numerous. The Sith believed power multiplied when shared. He understood it only divided. Every apprentice was a future rival. Every ally was a delayed threat. And every council was a breeding ground for collapse. The more Sith existed, the more energy was wasted on internal struggle instead of purpose. He did not hate the Sith. He believed he was saving them. This was the difference between him and those who came before. They sought to rule. He sought to refine. He did not want an empire that burned brightly and died quickly. He wanted an order that could endure beyond memory. He studied the past obsessively. Ancient Sith lords who ruled worlds, and only to be overthrown by their own students. Dark councils that promised unity, yet dissolved into blood within generations. Armies that marched outward while rot spread inward. The conclusion was unavoidable. The Sith could not survive as they were. If they continued, extinction was not a possibility. It was certainty. He did not announce this truth. He waited. He allowed the remaining Sith to continue their wars, to betray and consume one another, knowing the cycle would complete itself. He watched patiently as rivals eliminated themselves, mistaking ambition for strength. The galaxy thought the Sith were fading. He knew they were being purified. By the time he acted, there were few left who mattered, fewer still who understood what was coming. The force around him felt heavy, focused, as if responding to intention sharpened by restraint rather than rage. This Sith did not seek followers. He sought succession. Not many, only one. The idea formed slowly, dangerously simple. And if power corrupted through numbers, then numbers were the flaw. If betrayal was inevitable, then it should be controlled. If ambition could not be removed, then it should be weaponized. Two would be enough. One to hold power, one to crave it. No councils, no armies, no rivals beyond what was required. The Sith had tried to dominate the galaxy through expansion and failed. He would dominate time instead. Generations would pass. The Jedi would grow complacent. The Republic would rot quietly. The Sith, would wait. He knew this path demanded cruelty beyond anything the Sith had practiced before. It required sacrificing tradition, erasing history, murdering the old order entirely. It meant becoming the architect of Sith extinction to ensure Sith survival. He accepted this without hesitation, because sentiment had already destroyed everything once. Standing among the ruins of countless failed empires, this Sith did not mourn the past. He learned from it, as he understood that the Sith did not need more power. They needed discipline enforced by scarcity. And so, in silence, surrounded by the dead weight of Sith history, the decision was made. The future of the dark side would no longer belong to many. It would belong to two. Endless armies had always been the Sith's greatest illusion. They believed numbers meant strength, that power grew louder when shared across legions, councils, and empires, stretching from system to system. And history proved the opposite. Every Sith army had collapsed inward. Every dark council had turned into a slaughterhouse. Every empire built on vast numbers had consumed itself long before the Jedi ever reached its borders. He understood this with painful clarity. Armies demanded loyalty, and loyalty was a lie the Sith could never truly afford. Fear held soldiers together only until ambition whispered a better offer. The stronger an army became, the more rivalries it created within its own ranks. And the Sith did not lose wars because they lacked strength. They lost because strength was divided. Every Sith Lord commanding troops believed themselves irreplaceable. Every general imagined ascension. Every apprentice saw opportunity in chaos. The battlefield was never only against the enemy. It existed behind the lines, inside command chambers, inside minds sharpened by hunger. He watched armies fracture under their own weight. Orders contradicted one another, so generals withheld reinforcements to weaken rivals. Victories were delayed to create openings for betrayal. Sith legions fought bravely, unaware their leaders were already plotting the next internal strike. This was not failure of discipline. It was the nature of Sith belief. The Sith taught that power justified rule. Armies simply multiplied the number of beings who believed they deserved to rule. No structure could survive that contradiction for long. He saw how Jedi armies functioned differently. Unity came from shared restraint, from rules that limited ambition. The Sith had no such limits. Their armies reflected this. Powerful in moments, unstable across time. Endless armies created endless threats. More soldiers meant more secrets to guard. More commanders meant more rivals to watch. More territory meant more vulnerabilities. Expansion stretched attention thin, forcing Sith Lords to rely on subordinates who could not be trusted. He recognized the pattern repeated across centuries. The Sith believed domination required visibility. He understood survival required disappearance. Armies announced presence. Empires invited resistance. The Jedi could tolerate an enemy they could not see. They could never ignore one that stood openly against them. Armies drew the Jedi closer. Always. Every time the Sith gathered strength publicly, the Jedi responded. Not immediately, but eventually. Patrols increased. Councils debated. And crusades were prepared. Time was the Jedi's ally when threats revealed themselves. Endless armies shortened patience. He dismantled this belief piece by piece. Power did not need to be seen to be effective. Fear did not need banners. Control did not require territory. Influence could be exercised quietly, through manipulation rather than occupation. The Sith had mistaken conquest for victory. Real victory was endurance. Armies aged, soldiers died, loyalties shifted. Knowledge was lost with every fallen commander. An order that relied on numbers would eventually exhaust itself, no matter how powerful it appeared. Two would not. Two could move without notice. Two could hide without fragmenting. Two could focus power instead of scattering it across egos and ambitions that demanded constant control. One to wield power fully. One to desire it completely. No army could betray if there was no army to command. No council could fracture if none existed. So no empire could collapse if it was never built. He accepted the cost of this truth. The Sith would abandon everything they believed had made them strong. Their armies, their titles, their visible dominance. All would be sacrificed for something quieter and far more dangerous. The lie of endless armies would die with the old Sith, and in its place, a weapon far more patient would be born. Two was not a compromise. It was an execution. He understood that the Sith could not be restrained by teaching alone. Philosophy had failed, tradition had failed, councils, empires, and armies had all collapsed under the same weight. The Sith did not need guidance. They needed a cage shaped like destiny. Two was that cage. One Sith to hold absolute power, unchallenged and focused. One Sith to desire that power with total devotion. Nothing more, nothing less. Every flaw that had destroyed the old order was accounted for in this design. An ambition would no longer scatter across dozens of rivals. It would be concentrated. Betrayal would no longer be random and wasteful. It would be inevitable and purposeful. The master would rule knowing replacement was coming. The apprentice would serve knowing murder was required. Both would grow stronger because neither could rest, neither could trust, neither could afford weakness. This was not balance. It was pressure. Under this structure, the Sith would refine themselves through generations instead of devouring themselves all at once. Knowledge would no longer be diluted. Every lesson would pass directly from master to apprentice, sharpened by secrecy and fear of loss. Nothing would be written openly. Everything would be remembered. The master would teach only what the apprentice was ready to use. The apprentice would learn knowing survival required patience, deception, and timing. Power would grow slowly, carefully, without attracting attention. Two Sith could hide where thousands could not. The Jedi would feel absence, not threat. They would sense quiet where chaos once existed. They would believe victory had already been achieved, that the dark side had burned itself out through excess. That belief would become their greatest weakness. Under the rule of two, failure would no longer be catastrophic. If a master fell, the apprentice endured. If an apprentice failed, the master survived to choose another. And the line would continue unbroken, each generation stronger than the last. The Sith would no longer fear extinction. They would engineer survival. This design demanded cruelty without hesitation. Apprentices would be broken deliberately, pushed to extremes to ensure only the most resilient endured. Masters would accept their own deaths as necessary steps in refinement, not tragedies. Attachment had no place here. Sentiment was a flaw the Sith could no longer afford. Two also meant responsibility. The master could no longer hide behind councils or armies. Every failure was personal. Every weakness was fatal. Power would be absolute, but so would accountability. The Sith had never known accountability. This alone would change everything. The apprentice would be taught not to overthrow impulsively, but perfectly. Patience would be weaponized. Obedience would be performed, not felt. Every generation would study the failures of the last through living example, not broken records. The Sith would become ghosts. No more temples, no more banners, no more open wars. Their influence would move through shadows, through governments, through bloodlines, through ideas planted quietly and allowed to grow. The galaxy would change without ever seeing the hand that shaped it. Two Sith could wait centuries. Two Sith could afford to lose battles. Two Sith could survive invisibly until the moment was right. He did not call this mercy. He called it necessity. And the rule of two was not created to make the Sith kind, fair, or balanced. It was created to make them inevitable, to ensure that no matter how long it took, no matter how many generations passed, the dark side would return focused, disciplined, and unstoppable. The old Sith believed power should be shared. He understood power must be inherited through violence and patience. And with that understanding, the future of the Sith was sealed, not through conquest, but through succession. And the old Sith did not fall in a final war. They faded, one by one, removed with precision rather than spectacle. There were no announcements, no declarations of reform. The galaxy never heard that the Sith Order had been dismantled from within. What remained of the old empires simply stopped existing, their lords disappearing into betrayal, ritual deaths, and carefully engineered conflicts that left no witnesses behind. He allowed it to happen. Those Sith who still clung to armies, titles, and an open dominance were the easiest to remove. They drew attention. They trusted numbers. They believed survival meant visibility. Each of them became a lesson in what the future would not tolerate. Some were slain directly. Others were guided into wars they could not win. A few were left alone, allowed to overreach until the Jedi finished what ambition started. The result was the same. Silence replaced their names. Knowledge was not destroyed recklessly. It was curated, and teachings that served endurance were preserved. Rituals that encouraged excess were erased. Entire bloodlines were ended when they proved incapable of adapting to secrecy and restraint. This was not chaos. It was selection. The old Sith believed strength meant expansion. The new doctrine demanded compression. Everything unnecessary was cut away, leaving only what could survive unseen. Power was stripped of ceremony and reduced to function. Two Sith remained, not as rulers of an empire, but as inheritors of its ashes. The master carried the accumulated knowledge of centuries, refined through loss and deliberate omission. The apprentice carried hunger, sharpened by denial, taught to desire power without being allowed to touch it fully. The old order would have called this cruelty. He called it mercy, because extinction would have been easier. The Sith who survived did not mourn the past. Mourning implied attachment, and attachment had already proven fatal. The ruins of temples were left untouched, allowed to decay into myth. Let archaeologists find bones and speculate. Let Jedi historians argue over dates and names. Truth no longer mattered. Continuity did. From that moment forward, the Sith stopped measuring time in victories or defeats. They measured it in generations. Each master knew they would be replaced. Each apprentice knew they must become worthy of replacement. Failure meant death. Success meant succession. Yet the Jedi sensed something change, but could not define it. The Force felt quieter, less chaotic. The dark side no longer flared openly. Councils debated whether the Sith were finally gone, destroyed by their own excesses, as history suggested they always would be. The conclusion was comforting. It was also wrong. The Sith were not extinct. They were concentrated. The old Sith had died quietly, exactly as planned. Their noise had ended. Their instability had been corrected. As what remained was not an empire, but a line. A single thread of darkness woven carefully through time. This transformation came at a cost no one else could see. The Sith abandoned glory forever. They gave up recognition, worship, and fear on a galactic scale. They chose invisibility over dominance, patience over conquest. In return, they gained something they had never possessed before: control. The rule of two did not make the Sith stronger overnight. It made them inevitable. It ensured that every lesson learned through centuries of failure would not be lost again to infighting or pride. The Jedi believed the war was over. The galaxy moved on. And somewhere in the shadows, two Sith watched history continue. Knowing they no longer needed to rush, the future would come to them, shaped quietly, deliberately, one generation at a time. The old Sith were gone. What replaced them would not be so easily erased. The galaxy did not notice when the Sith disappeared. That was the point. After centuries of war, betrayal, and collapse, silence felt like relief. Republic records grew quieter. Jedi archives closed chapters with careful finality. The Sith were listed as extinct, another cautionary tale of darkness destroying itself through excess. The galaxy moved on, Trade routes reopened, worlds rebuilt. Generations were born who knew the Sith only as distant myths, so exaggerated by time and retold without fear. The name lost its weight. The threat lost its urgency. The Jedi welcomed this silence. Without a visible enemy, the Order turned inward. Training focused on peacekeeping, diplomacy, and balance restored. Vigilance softened into routine. Patrols continued, but the sense of imminent danger faded with every quiet year. The Force felt calmer, not lighter, just undisturbed. What the galaxy mistook for absence was intention. And the Sith had not vanished in panic or defeat. They had withdrawn deliberately, guided by a doctrine that understood something their enemies never fully grasped. Visibility invites destruction. The Sith abandoned the need to be seen. No more temples that could be mapped. No more rituals that left scars in the Force. No more empires that demanded response. They learned to exist beneath notice, moving slowly, carefully, leaving no echo strong enough to be traced. Generations passed. Masters aged and died in secrecy. Apprentices replaced them without ceremony. Knowledge flowed quietly, passed through whispers, memories, and discipline enforced by fear of extinction. Every lesson was taught with the understanding that survival mattered more than recognition. The Sith learned to erase their own footprints. They used no banners, claimed no worlds, ruled no systems openly. Influence replaced occupation. Manipulation replaced command. Power was exercised indirectly, and through others who never understood, who guided their choices. The Republic never suspected. Conflicts still happened. Corruption still spread. Wars still ignited and burned out. The Sith did not cause every tragedy, but they learned to benefit from them. Chaos created openings. Ambition created leverage. Fear created opportunity. The Sith waited. Patience became their greatest weapon. While the Jedi responded to immediate threats, the Sith planned across lifetimes. So they observed how institutions weakened over time, how ideals eroded, how power concentrated in predictable ways. They learned where to apply pressure. The Jedi sensed nothing because there was nothing loud to sense. No armies, no rituals that screamed through the Force. Only subtle influence, carefully masked beneath the actions of others. Some Jedi felt unease, a faint pressure during meditation, a sense that something had been overlooked. These feelings were dismissed gently. The Sith were gone. Records said so. History agreed. The Jedi trusted history. The Sith trusted time. 1,000 years passed without open conflict, without banners, without war. The galaxy took this as proof of victory. Darkness, it believed, had been defeated by its own nature. But darkness had simply learned restraint. The Sith understood that survival required invisibility, that power could grow quietly, refining itself without interference, that waiting was not weakness, but preparation. And they allowed the galaxy to forget them. They allowed the Jedi to believe they had won. Because when belief settles into certainty, it becomes blind. And in that blindness, the Sith found the perfect place to endure. Hiding was not instinct for the Sith. It was learned, refined through generations, that understood extinction was always one mistake away. The rule of two demanded more than secrecy. It demanded discipline so complete that even the Force itself revealed nothing. Masters trained apprentices, not only in power, but in absence. How to move without leaving ripples. How to act without imprinting intent. How to exist without being noticed. The Sith stopped gathering in places of strength. They avoided worlds saturated with dark side energy, knowing such locations drew attention eventually. Instead, they chose ordinary systems, forgettable planets, places where nothing important was expected to happen. There, power could grow quietly, masked by normal life, and every action was measured. A Sith did not strike unless the outcome erased its own trail. They did not kill when influence could achieve the same result. Violence was no longer expression. It was calculation, used only when silence demanded it. Knowledge was protected with extreme care. Holocrons were hidden, destroyed, or deliberately incomplete. No single artifact carried the whole truth. No apprentice learned everything at once. If discovery came, fragments would mislead rather than reveal. The Sith accepted loss as part of survival. If a master fell unexpectedly, the apprentice did not seek revenge openly. They vanished. They waited. They rebuilt elsewhere, carrying only what could not be traced. Survival mattered more than pride. The Jedi never realized how thorough this hiding became. Force-sensitive disturbances were masked behind others. Wars caused by ambition or fear were allowed to unfold naturally, providing cover. When the dark side surged, it was attributed to conflict, should not guidance. The Sith hid behind the chaos of the galaxy itself. They learned to influence bloodlines, subtle suggestions, quiet encouragement, placing the right people in positions where their own flaws would guide outcomes. The Sith did not rule these individuals. They nurtured them, fed ambition, then stepped back and watched events unfold as desired. Nothing traced back. Patience replaced urgency. A Sith might spend decades doing nothing visible, watching institutions weaken, and observing how ideals bent under pressure, waiting for moments where the smallest push created the largest collapse. This was power without spectacle. The apprentice learned to suppress impulse. Rage was not removed, but delayed. Desire was not denied, but focused toward distant outcomes. Emotional control became survival, because exposure meant death. The Force responded differently to this restraint. It felt quieter, deeper, less volatile, not weaker, more precise. Power was no longer flaring, and it was compressing. The Jedi mistook this silence for absence. They taught that the dark side thrived on passion and excess. They expected noise, corruption, visible imbalance. What they did not anticipate was a darkness that refused to announce itself. Some Jedi came close. They sensed patterns in politics, repeated failures, leaders who rose too predictably, conflicts that resolved in ways that weakened the Republic without obvious cause. These Jedi raised concerns. They were overruled. There was no enemy to point to, no evidence, only intuition. An intuition without proof was not enough to challenge 1,000 years of peace. The Sith depended on this. Hiding was not just physical, it was psychological. The greatest concealment was convincing the galaxy that nothing needed to be looked for. Over centuries, this art became instinct. Masters passed it to apprentices as the first and most important lesson. Power revealed too early was wasted. Survival required invisibility. The Sith did not crave recognition anymore. They craved certainty. Certainty that when they finally acted openly again, it would not be out of desperation, but inevitability. The long art of hiding was not about fear of the Jedi. It was about patience stronger than fear. Patience became the Sith's sharpest weapon, because it cut without ever being seen. Generations passed with no open victories, no visible defeats, and no acknowledgement that the Sith still existed. And masters trained apprentices, knowing they would never witness the culmination of their work. That did not trouble them. The goal was no longer personal triumph. It was continuity. Time itself became an ally. The Sith learned how civilizations aged. They watched how republics promised equality and slowly centralized power. They observed how fear reshaped laws, how emergency measures never fully faded, how institutions built on ideals eroded under convenience and compromise. They did not rush to intervene. They waited until decay invited guidance. A Sith master might spend an entire lifetime studying a single system, learning its weaknesses, its pride, its blind spots. They learned which leaders craved approval, which feared irrelevance, which would trade principle for security if pushed gently enough. No blades were drawn, a word here, a suggestion there, a silent endorsement at the right moment. The Sith understood that patience was not inactivity, and it was positioning. Every delay increased leverage. Every year, the Jedi remained unaware, made eventual victory more certain. Apprentices struggled with this lesson at first. They were born into a galaxy that rewarded action, speed, and visible success. They felt the hunger for dominance burn inside them, demanding release. Masters broke this impulse carefully, teaching that impatience was the fastest path to extinction. Those who could not learn this did not survive. And some apprentices acted too soon. They manipulated openly. They left traces in the Force. Jedi noticed. Investigations followed. These apprentices vanished from history, removed quietly by their own masters, or destroyed by the very attention they attracted. Their failures became instruction. The Sith refined delay into discipline. Rage was stored, not spent. Desire was sharpened by denial. Hatred was no longer explosive. It was precise. The Force responded to this control, and instead of surging wildly, it settled around the Sith like a deep current, steady and immense. Power accumulated slowly, compounding across generations. Each master added to it. Each apprentice inherited more than the last. The Jedi felt none of this. They measured threats by movement, by conflict, by visible imbalance. Silence signaled safety. Calm signaled success. The Sith relied on this misunderstanding completely. Patience allowed the Sith to choose moments rather than react to them. And when the Republic weakened, they nudged it. When corruption rose naturally, they guided it. When war erupted, they allowed others to fight it, stepping in only to shape outcomes quietly. Losses did not discourage them. If a plan failed, it was not abandoned. It was delayed. Another generation would try again, armed with better knowledge and fewer mistakes. Time forgave failure as long as survival continued. The Sith stopped thinking in years. They thought in centuries. So masters trained apprentices with the understanding that they were links, not endpoints. Pride was redirected away from personal achievement and toward the endurance of the line itself. To die unnoticed was acceptable. To die exposed was unforgivable. This perspective changed everything. The Sith no longer feared setbacks. They expected them. Patience made them immune to frustration. While the Jedi sought resolution, the Sith embraced incompletion. A blade strikes once and is done, and patience cuts endlessly. By the end of the 1,000 years, the Sith had not conquered a single world openly. They had not raised a single banner. They had not won a single celebrated war. And yet, the galaxy was closer to collapse than it had ever been. Not because of force, but because someone had waited long enough to understand exactly where to press. Extinction was a word the galaxy used when it wanted closure. For the Sith, it became camouflage. The Republic records mark the dark side as a closed chapter. Jedi younglings studied the Sith as ancient history, their stories simplified into lessons about excess and self-destruction. Names lost detail, dates blurred. The threat became theoretical. The Jedi accepted this willingly. They believed the Sith had failed because they always failed. Darkness, they taught, could not sustain order. It consumed itself. Balance always returned. This belief became comfort, so repeated so often it hardened into certainty. Certainty dulled caution. The Force felt quieter than it had in centuries. No massive disturbances, no dark rituals echoing across star systems, no empires rising in defiance of the Republic. To the Jedi, this silence confirmed extinction. But silence was not emptiness. The Sith existed in the margins of history now, where records were incomplete and attention was scarce. They left no symbols to fear, no leaders to condemn, no ideology to debate. And their absence became proof of their defeat. This was their greatest success. The rule of two ensured that survival did not depend on recognition. Only two minds carried the legacy at any time, bound by secrecy and purpose. If one fell, the other endured. The line never broke. Generations of Jedi lived and died without ever sensing a Sith directly. Some felt disturbances they could not name, a tightening in the Force around political decisions, wars that escalated too efficiently, to leaders whose ambitions aligned too perfectly with fear. These moments were attributed to human nature, to chance, to flaws in the Republic itself. No one looked deeper. The Sith allowed this interpretation to stand. They encouraged it subtly, guiding blame toward visible corruption rather than hidden design. Let the galaxy accuse itself. Let it search for villains it could see. Extinction made investigation unnecessary. Why search for what no longer exists? The Sith used this freedom carefully, and they never rushed to reveal themselves. Exposure would have undone centuries of restraint. Every action was weighed against one question only. Does this preserve the line? If the answer was no, it was abandoned. The Sith did not seek to rule openly anymore. They sought to shape outcomes that would lead, eventually, to opportunity. Their patience ensured that when they finally emerged, resistance would be fragmented, unprepared, and divided. The Jedi were strong, but they were complacent. And they trusted that the past had taught its final lesson, that darkness, once exposed, always destroyed itself. They did not consider that darkness could learn. Extinct in name only, the Sith had become something new. Not conquerors, not warlords, not emperors. Architects. They studied prophecy, not as destiny, but as probability. They explored influence, not domination. They refined the dark side not as expression, but as discipline. Everything excess had been stripped away. So what remained was intent. The Sith no longer needed to announce their return. The galaxy would invite them back through its own failures. When fear outweighed hope, when control replaced trust, when a single voice promised order at any cost. That moment was not rushed. It was inevitable. The Jedi believed the Sith were gone. They were wrong. The Sith were closer than ever, not as an army, but as a shadow woven into the structure of the galaxy itself, and waiting for the right era to step forward and be seen again. Extinction had given them time, and time had made them patient. Power no longer announced itself through banners or fleets. It moved quietly, unseen, settling into the foundations of the Republic like rot inside stone. The Sith understood something the Old Order never had. Control did not require visibility. In fact, Visibility weakened it. The more openly power was displayed, the more resistance it invited. So the Sith chose another path. They became invisible. They did not sit on thrones or command armies. And they stood behind decisions, behind appointments, behind laws passed in moments of fear. Their presence was never obvious enough to challenge, never clear enough to accuse. The Republic believed itself free. That belief made it vulnerable. The Sith studied systems of governance with the same care they once studied battle. They learned how committees delayed action, how emergency powers expanded quietly, how leaders could be guided without ever knowing they were being guided. And a suggestion whispered at the right moment mattered more than 1,000 soldiers. The Sith placed no agents openly. They did not rule senators like puppets. They nurtured ambition instead. A fearful official needed only encouragement. A desperate one needed reassurance. The Sith offered neither loyalty nor commands, only opportunity. Most never knew who helped them rise. Policies shifted slowly. Laws intended to protect were rewritten to control. Surveillance expanded in the name of safety. So militarization increased under the promise of stability. Each change felt reasonable alone. Together, they reshaped the Republic. The Sith did not force corruption. They allowed it. They understood that institutions decay naturally when stretched by fear and convenience. The Sith simply guided that decay, ensuring it bent in directions that would serve them later. Bloodlines mattered again, not through ancient titles, but through influence. Families rose whose power outlived elections and reforms. Wealth concentrated. Authority passed quietly from one generation to the next. The Sith watched these lines carefully, intervening only when necessary. Destiny did not need to be rewritten. It needed to be nudged. Wars erupted across the galaxy. Trade disputes became conflicts. Border tensions escalated into prolonged campaigns. The Sith did not start every war, but they ensured none ended cleanly. Conflict exhausted oversight. Emergency measures normalized control. Militaries grew accustomed to acting without debate. Each war left the Republic more centralized, more dependent on decisive leadership. The Sith never appeared on battlefields. They didn't need to. Fear did their work for them. The Jedi sensed imbalance, but it felt different from past darkness. There were no temples of shadow, no rituals tearing through the Force. Just pressure, subtle, persistent, hard to locate. The Jedi investigated symptoms, and not causes. They debated ethics while laws changed. They mediated disputes while institutions shifted beneath them. The Sith had learned to move where the Jedi did not look. Power without a face could not be confronted. By the time questions arose, answers were already buried beneath layers of procedure and legality. Every decision could be justified, every outcome blamed on circumstance. The Sith remained absent from accusation. This was their triumph. So they no longer needed to destroy the Republic. They were reshaping it from within, patiently, methodically, across generations that believed themselves free. The Republic still stood, but its foundations were no longer its own. And somewhere beyond the reach of accusation or proof, the Sith watched quietly, knowing that when power has no face, it also has no enemy. Laws were never written with darkness in their language. They were written with fear, urgency, and the promise of safety. The Sith understood that law was stronger than force. Armies could be resisted, weapons could be destroyed. But laws, once accepted, governed behavior long after their authors were forgotten. Control enforced through legality felt like order, not oppression. The Republic excelled at this. In times of crisis, debate shortened. In moments of fear, hesitation disappeared. Emergency measures were passed quickly, framed as temporary solutions to immediate threats. Each one felt reasonable, so each one stayed longer than intended. The Sith never proposed these laws directly. They waited for the Republic to ask for them. A system under pressure seeks efficiency. The Sith applied pressure carefully, ensuring threats appeared just severe enough to justify expanded authority. Piracy surged in one sector. Separatist movements gained momentum in another. Border disputes escalated unexpectedly. Fear did the rest. Legislators demanded stronger oversight. As intelligence agencies gained broader reach, military leaders were granted autonomy to act without delay. Each change was legal. Each vote was recorded. Each decision followed procedure. Nothing appeared wrong. The Sith guided which voices were amplified. They ensured the most fearful arguments were heard first. Calm dissent was delayed, buried beneath urgency. By the time reflection arrived, the law was already in place. Once written, laws shaped thought. Citizens adjusted behavior to comply, and officials learned what actions were rewarded. Institutions adapted around new authority, embedding it into routine. What began as exception became expectation. The Sith relied on this transformation. They understood that no one questions a system they grow accustomed to. Resistance fades when control is normalized. The Republic still believed itself just, because injustice now wore the mask of legality. The Jedi observed these changes uneasily. They sensed imbalance, but imbalance framed as order was difficult to challenge. The Jedi were not lawmakers. They did not command votes. Their role was advisory, moral rather than political, and morality struggled against fear. The Sith did not corrupt every law. They didn't need to. They focused on key moments, key clauses, small shifts with large consequences. Surveillance justified by protection. Detention permitted without oversight. Authority centralized to respond faster to threats. Each law narrowed choice, and each restriction reduced freedom slightly. Never enough to provoke outrage. The Sith understood thresholds. They knew how much pressure could be applied before resistance formed. They stayed just below it. Bloodlines benefited quietly. Families aligned with expanding authority rose steadily. Contracts flowed to the same names. Influence passed predictably. The Sith did not create these elites, but they protected them, ensuring loyalty formed naturally through advantage. Corruption no longer needed to hide. It operated openly, legally. Wars that followed were managed through these laws. Oversight committees deferred to emergency powers. Military actions bypassed debate. The Republic learned to act first and justify later. The Sith never appeared in these chambers. They didn't need to. Every law written in fear served them. Every expansion of control narrowed the Jedi's ability to respond. Balance shifted, not through violence, but through paperwork signed under pressure. The Republic still believed itself democratic. That belief was enough. The Sith had learned the most effective form of domination was consent shaped by fear. Laws written in darkness did not announce their purpose. They blended into governance, indistinguishable from necessity. By the time anyone questioned them, generations had grown up knowing nothing else. And the Sith watched patiently, knowing that a republic governed by fear would one day seek a savior strong enough to control it completely. Wars did not begin with Sith orders or dark rituals. They began with disagreements that felt ordinary, inevitable, and unresolved. The Sith understood that war was the fastest way to exhaust a republic without ever touching it directly. Conflict strained institutions, concentrated power, and forced decisions to be made quickly. Under pressure, principles bent, oversight weakened, and fear justified authority. The Sith never needed to start wars. They only needed to ensure they did not end. Trade disputes were allowed to fester. Border conflicts escalated through miscommunication and delayed mediation. Local rebellions gained support just enough to require military response, but never enough to win. Every spark was guided carefully, kept burning without becoming uncontrollable. The Republic responded as it always had, with committees, with votes, with fleets, and each deployment expanded military authority. Each emergency justified suspension of normal procedure. Commanders were granted autonomy. Intelligence agencies operated with less scrutiny. War demanded efficiency, and efficiency demanded control. The Sith watched patiently. They influenced where conflicts erupted, not how they were fought. They nudged negotiations toward failure. They ensured ceasefires collapsed under mistrust. And they allowed victories that created new enemies and defeats that demanded retaliation. No war resolved anything. Soldiers returned exhausted. Citizens accepted sacrifice as normal. Resources drained steadily. The Republic grew accustomed to living in a permanent state of threat, where peace felt temporary and vigilance felt responsible. The Jedi were drawn into these wars reluctantly. They served as generals, negotiators, peacekeepers. They believed presence could limit suffering. But war reshaped them as well. Jedi learned to command armies, to make strategic compromises, to accept losses as necessary. The Sith noted every change. The Jedi were strongest as guardians, weakest as commanders. War pulled them away from contemplation and into reaction. Each battlefield demanded immediate decisions, leaving little time to sense the deeper currents shaping events. The Sith hid within those currents. They studied how war altered perception, how fear simplified choices, and how prolonged conflict made citizens long for order above all else. The Sith did not promise victory. They promised stability. Wars served another will because they trained the galaxy to accept control. As conflicts dragged on, voices calling for stronger leadership grew louder. Debates were framed as security versus chaos. Dissent was labeled irresponsible. The Republic still voted, but the range of acceptable choices narrowed. The Sith allowed heroes to rise. Her generals celebrated for decisive action. Leaders praised for restoring order temporarily. These figures were not Sith puppets. They were ambitious individuals responding naturally to circumstance. The Sith simply ensured circumstances favored them. Every war produced such figures. Some failed. Some succeeded briefly. All left marks on the system. The Jedi sensed something wrong, but the pattern was difficult to isolate. No single war revealed manipulation. Each conflict had plausible causes, and each escalation followed logical steps. The Sith never appeared as instigators. They appeared nowhere at all. War became background noise. Generations grew up knowing nothing else. Children learned history through battles rather than ideals. The Republic's identity shifted slowly, from democratic protector to militarized authority, managing endless crises. The Sith did not rush this transformation. They allowed exhaustion to do the work. War thinned resistance. It normalized loss. It trained the galaxy to accept that safety required strength above deliberation. By the time some Jedi questioned the pattern, the answer was unclear. Who started these wars? Who benefited most? The Sith had ensured the answer was never obvious. Wars that served another will did not need Sith banners. They needed time, fear, and a republic willing to trade freedom for the promise of lasting peace. The galaxy was learning that promise by heart, and the Sith waited for the moment when it would demand someone strong enough to enforce it. Some Jedi felt it long before anyone could name it. Not a presence, not a voice, but a shape that did not belong. It came during meditation, when the Force should have felt open and clear. Instead, there was pressure, a sense of guidance without direction, outcomes aligning too neatly, as if probability itself had been bent by an unseen hand. These Jedi could not describe it clearly. There was no darkness flaring in the Force, no ritual scars, no nexus of shadow to investigate. What they felt was absence where resistance should have been, like a path smoothed before anyone chose to walk it. They brought their concerns to the Order carefully. Masters listened with patience, but answers were elusive. The Sith were gone. Records were clear. History was consistent. The galaxy's troubles could be explained through politics, fear, and human failure. There was no need to imagine a hidden enemy. And yet, the feeling persisted. Wars unfolded with uncanny efficiency. Leaders rose and fell in patterns that felt engineered rather than random. Laws passed that narrowed freedom while claiming protection. Each event made sense on its own. Together, they formed a contour that unsettled those who could feel the Force deeply. The Jedi struggled to investigate something without form. They followed conflicts, traced political decisions, yet examined bloodlines and alliances. Everywhere they looked, they found only ordinary ambition, ordinary fear, ordinary greed. Nothing pointed clearly to a guiding intelligence. That was the problem. The Sith had learned to shape outcomes without appearing in them. They did not push the Force violently. They nudged it gently, allowing others to do the moving. To the Jedi, it felt like the Force itself was choosing darker paths without being coerced. And this contradicted everything they had been taught. The dark side was supposed to be loud. It was supposed to corrupt openly. It was supposed to announce itself through imbalance and excess. What the Jedi sensed did none of these things. It felt intentional. Some Jedi became obsessed with the pattern. They withdrew from politics, focusing inward, trying to map this wrongness through meditation alone. Others doubled their involvement, believing proximity to power might reveal its source, and neither approach worked. The Sith were too careful. The Jedi Council debated these concerns cautiously. Without evidence, they could not justify drastic action. To accuse unseen manipulators risked paranoia. The Order had seen where fear-driven suspicion led in the past. Restraint won the argument. The Jedi trusted balance to correct itself. This trust became vulnerability. As years passed, the Jedi who sensed the wrong shape grew fewer. Some died in wars. Some left the Order, disillusioned. And some convinced themselves the feeling was personal doubt rather than external influence. The Sith relied on this erosion. They did not silence these Jedi directly. They allowed time to wear them down. Doubt isolated them. Consensus dismissed them. The Order moved forward, confident in its understanding of the past. The Force continued to feel wrong, not broken, not corrupted, just guided. The Jedi never realized that the Sith no longer needed to hide behind darkness, and they had learned to hide behind normality, behind systems functioning exactly as designed, behind a galaxy that blamed itself for its own decline. The Sith had reshaped the battlefield. There were no fronts to defend, no enemy to confront, only consequences unfolding naturally, exactly as planned. The Jedi who felt the wrong shape were not wrong. They were simply too late. By the time the Order understood that absence itself could be a weapon, the Republic had already changed beyond recognition. So the Sith did not stand against the Jedi. They stood behind the galaxy, and from that position, they could not be seen clearly enough to stop. The collapse did not begin with invasion fleets or burning worlds. It began with agreement. The Republic was not conquered. It was invited to surrender pieces of itself, one law at a time, one exception at a time, each decision justified by fear and necessity. No single moment felt like betrayal. Each choice felt responsible. That was the design. The Sith had learned that people rarely resist what they believe they have chosen. Force creates enemies, so permission creates compliance. The Republic was taught to ask for the chains it would later struggle to remove. Crisis became routine. Every emergency expanded authority. Every threat demanded faster response. Oversight slowed action, so it was bypassed. Debate endangered lives, so it was postponed. Each delay felt temporary. Each expansion felt reversible. None of it was. The Senate voted again and again to centralize power, believing unity would bring safety. Systems agreed to sacrifice autonomy for protection. Citizens accepted surveillance in exchange for peace. Fear made these trades feel fair. The Sith never argued otherwise. They did not force collapse. They curated it. The Republic's greatest weakness was faith in its own goodness. Leaders believed intention mattered more than outcome. As long as decisions were made legally, morality felt intact. The Sith understood legality could be shaped. Committees grew silent. Emergency councils grew permanent. Temporary powers gained names, offices, and staffs. The Republic still believed itself free. That belief was carefully preserved. Every restriction came with explanation. Every loss of freedom came with promise of safety. When critics spoke, they were not silenced. They were delayed, buried in procedure, drowned out by urgency. Nothing felt stolen. It felt donated. The Jedi watched these changes with concern, but not alarm. They trusted the Republic's institutions. They believed balance would correct excess. After all, this was not the rise of tyranny through violence. This was governance adapting to danger. The Sith depended on that trust. They ensured no single decision crossed a line too clearly. Collapse was stretched across decades, so no generation felt responsible. Each step seemed smaller than the last. The Republic grew accustomed to being managed. Leaders deferred upward. Systems waited for direction. Responsibility flowed toward a single center, because coordination felt safer than independence. The Sith had not named that center yet. They did not need to. Permission was already given. Wars provided justification. Threats provided urgency. Fear provided consent. The Republic learned to equate order with control, speed with strength, obedience with safety. The Sith simply watched. They understood that once people accepted protection at the cost of choice, reversal became unlikely. Freedom, and once traded, rarely returns willingly. Stability becomes habit. Authority becomes expectation. The Republic did not collapse in a day. It bent. Each compromise weakened resistance. Each exception normalized power. By the time anyone noticed the shape of what was forming, it already felt necessary. The Sith had planned for this moment across generations. They knew the Republic would not fall to hatred. It would fall to responsibility taken too far, to trust placed without suspicion, and to fear dressed as care. No invasion was needed. No coup was required. The Republic handed over its future politely, believing it was doing the right thing. And somewhere in the shadows, The Sith recognized the sound they had been waiting for. Permission. Trust was never taken by force. It was offered freely because the Jedi believed it was deserved. For 1,000 years, the Jedi Order had been the Republic's conscience. Guardians without ambition, warriors without hunger for power. Yet when they spoke, worlds listened. When they intervened, systems complied. Their restraint built faith deeper than any law. The Sith understood this perfectly. They did not need to destroy the Jedi. They needed to rely on them. The Republic trusted the Jedi to sense danger before it arrived, to warn when darkness gathered, to stand between fear and chaos. This trust became habit, then assumption. If the Jedi did not object, things must be under control. And the Sith shaped their plans around that assumption. They ensured nothing felt overtly dark. No ritual scars, no screaming imbalance in the Force. Every decision unfolded within legal frameworks, guided by reason and necessity. To the Jedi, it felt like politics, not corruption. Trust blinded caution. The Jedi advised patience as power centralized. They urged calm during emergencies. They believed cooperation with authority preserved peace. Their voices reassured a republic already leaning toward control. The Sith never contradicted them. They hid behind the Jedi's credibility, knowing every endorsement, every silence carried weight. When the Jedi accepted expanded authority as temporary, the Republic accepted it as justified. The Order became a shield, not intentionally, not knowingly, but effectively. The Jedi trusted that the Force would warn them if something truly dangerous emerged, and they believed darkness announced itself through excess, cruelty, and visible imbalance. What they faced instead was careful moderation. The Sith had learned restraint better than the Jedi ever had. They fed trust slowly. Leaders who worked closely with the Jedi were elevated. Policies the Jedi did not oppose were reinforced. Over time, alignment between the Order and authority appeared natural. The Republic took comfort in this harmony. The Jedi sensed pressure, but it felt internal. Stress from endless conflict. Fatigue from constant responsibility. They interpreted unease as burden, not warning. The Sith counted on that misinterpretation. They knew the Jedi feared overreaction more than manipulation. Acting without proof violated Jedi principles. To accuse unseen enemies risked paranoia, and paranoia had already scarred the Order's history. So the Jedi waited. They trusted balance to correct itself. The Sith weaponized that trust. Every delay allowed power to settle deeper. Every moment of restraint gave the Sith more room to maneuver. The Jedi were strongest when confronting visible threats. They were weakest when threats wore the face of stability. Some Jedi questioned quietly. They felt the pattern tightening. The way fear guided decisions too smoothly. The way authority flowed upward without resistance. These Jedi spoke carefully, uncertain even of their own doubts. Their concerns went unanswered, not dismissed, so not denied, simply postponed. Trust dulled urgency. The Sith never rushed exposure. They did not need to. As long as the Jedi believed they were partners in preservation, the plan remained untouched. The Republic trusted the Jedi. The Jedi trusted the Republic. The Sith trusted time. By the moment doubt sharpened into clarity, trust had already done its work. The structures built under its cover could not be dismantled without chaos. The Jedi were sworn to prevent. That was the final cruelty. And the Jedi would hesitate not because they were weak, but because they were loyal, because trust had shaped their judgment for generations. because acting against the Republic felt like betrayal of everything they stood for. The Sith had not corrupted the Jedi. They had relied on them, and trust, once placed, became the sharpest weapon of all. The day did not begin with warning or prophecy. It began like every other day the Jedi had learned to trust. Reports arrived as they always had. Some political tensions, emergency measures, requests for Jedi mediation. Nothing that suggested catastrophe, nothing that demanded immediate defiance. The Republic was functioning, strained but intact. That illusion mattered. The Jedi Council felt pressure in the Force, but it was diffuse, spread thin across systems already burdened by war and fear. There was no single source to confront, no clear enemy to name. Acting without clarity risked overreach, so they waited. So this hesitation was not weakness, it was principle. For generations, the Jedi had been taught that restraint preserved balance. Acting too soon could cause the very harm they were sworn to prevent. The Sith had planned for this. They ensured every alarming development had justification. Each decree followed legal process. Each order carried approval from elected bodies. To intervene would mean opposing the Republic itself. The Jedi had never done that before. When discussions turned urgent, the Council debated carefully. Some sensed danger, others urged patience. Without proof of Sith involvement, decisive action felt reckless. Accusations without evidence would fracture trust irreparably. Trust still guided them. By the time reports grew darker, authority had already consolidated. Security forces answered to fewer voices. Emergency commands bypassed normal oversight. Systems waited for direction rather than acting independently. The Jedi felt the window closing. But acting now meant confrontation. It meant choosing sides openly. It meant accepting responsibility for chaos that would follow. The Jedi had spent centuries preventing disorder, not causing it. So they hesitated again. This moment would later be remembered as failure. In truth, it was consistency. The Jedi acted exactly as they always had. They trusted institutions. They believed balance would reassert itself. They assumed reason would prevail. The Sith relied on that assumption. Orders were executed while the Jedi deliberated. Arrests were made legally. Power shifted through procedure. By the time the Jedi realized the scale of what was happening, the mechanisms were already in motion. Stopping them would require force. Force against the Republic. The Council faltered. Some Jedi moved independently, following instinct rather than consensus. Others remained, bound by process. The Order fractured quietly, divided by interpretation of duty rather than loyalty. The Sith needed only hours. The final confirmations arrived too late. Communications cut. Authority transferred. The shape the Jedi had sensed for years finally revealed itself, unmistakable and complete. The Republic had changed. The Jedi had not been defeated in battle. They had been outpaced by events shaped beyond their reach. Their hesitation had been reasonable, ethical, and devastating. When clarity finally arrived, options were gone. The Sith had anticipated every delay, every doubt, and every debate. They knew the Jedi would not strike first without certainty. They had ensured certainty would arrive only after action became impossible. This was the day the Jedi understood. Not that they were weak, but that they had been careful in a galaxy that rewarded patience only when it served power. The Force cried out then, not in warning, but in recognition. The moment had passed, and hesitation, once noble, became history. They did not emerge with thunder or prophecy. They stepped forward when resistance had already been taught to kneel. The galaxy did not see an invasion. It saw confirmation. Authority centralized. Commands unified. Order imposed swiftly, efficiently, and legally. What followed felt less like conquest and more like inevitability finally acknowledged. The Sith revealed themselves only after their work was complete. There were no armies marching from hidden worlds, no ancient banners raised over capitals. The Sith appeared through a single voice, a single figure sanctioned by law, empowered by fear, and accepted by institution already reshaped to obey. The Republic did not fall screaming. It exhaled. Systems complied because they had been trained to. Officials followed orders because procedure demanded it. Citizens accepted the change because it promised an end to chaos. The Sith had not broken the galaxy. They had convinced it to agree. The Jedi felt the shift instantly, and the Force twisted sharply, no longer masked by subtlety. What had been shaped gently for generations now revealed its true design. The dark side did not surge wildly. It settled, firm and complete, like a door finally locked. The Jedi were named enemies of order, not because they were feared, but because they were no longer useful. Their authority depended on moral trust, and trust had been transferred elsewhere. Laws turned against them with terrifying speed. Warrants replaced warrants, and allies hesitated. Worlds closed their doors. The Jedi were isolated by legality. Those who resisted were hunted as traitors. Those who fled were labeled fugitives. The Republic did not see this as tyranny. It saw it as protection against instability. The Sith watched calmly. They had no need to justify themselves to history. History had been prepared to justify them. Records were rewritten, narratives adjusted. The Jedi were reframed not as guardians, but as dangerous independents who refused to submit to lawful authority. The galaxy accepted this with relief. Fear had exhausted it. Order felt merciful. The Sith stepped into the light not as conquerors, but as caretakers. They spoke of unity, of safety, of ending war permanently. Their words echoed promises the galaxy had been waiting to hear, and the galaxy listened. The Jedi tried to warn others, but warnings sounded like defiance now. Without institutional trust, so their voices carried no weight. The very restraint that had defined them became evidence against them. The Sith had not overpowered the Jedi. They had replaced them. The Force itself seemed to recoil, sensing a future narrowing into certainty. Balance did not shatter. It was redefined. The dark side no longer hid. It governed. The Sith did not celebrate this moment. Celebration was unnecessary. They had waited 1,000 years for permission, trust, hesitation, and collapse to align. So when the time came, they acted without haste, knowing nothing remained to oppose them effectively. The galaxy broke not through violence, but through acceptance. That was the final lesson of the Sith. Power did not need to destroy what it could inherit. Control did not require fear when belief had already been shaped. As the Jedi Order fell into shadow and the Republic transformed into something unrecognizable, the Sith stood openly at last, not as monsters from legend, but as the natural conclusion of every compromise made in fear. The long game was over. The Sith had returned, and the galaxy realized, too late, that the fall had never been sudden. It had been planned. Victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like silence stretched too wide to fill. The Sith had achieved what centuries of war had failed to secure. They ruled openly now. Their enemies were scattered, their plans complete, their power unquestioned. The galaxy no longer resisted them in any organized way. Order had replaced chaos, exactly as promised. And yet, something was missing. There were no cheers in the halls of power, no shared relief, no sense of arrival. And the Sith stood at the center of everything they had shaped and felt the weight of it pressing inward rather than lifting them upward. This was not the victory the old Sith had imagined. Empires were easier to conquer than to hold. Fear worked quickly, but it demanded constant attention. Every system complied, but none trusted. Every official obeyed, but none felt loyal. Control required watching, and watching required distance. The Sith understood this immediately. Power isolated them, and where once they had thrived in secrecy, now every decision carried consequence. Every failure echoed. There was no one to blame, no council to hide behind. Authority was absolute, and so was responsibility. The galaxy feared them. That fear created obedience, but it did not create peace. It created tension, constant and exhausting. The Sith could feel it everywhere, a low hum of resentment, anxiety, and suppressed defiance. Victory had silenced opposition, not erased it. Yet the Sith had everything they wanted, and nothing they could rest upon. The dark side responded differently now. Where it once surged with hunger and anticipation, it now settled into something colder, heavier, less forgiving. Power no longer grew naturally. It had to be maintained, defended, asserted again and again. Dominion demanded vigilance. The Sith began to see threats everywhere, not because they were weak, but because they were exposed. Every officer could become a traitor, and every loyal servant could be hiding ambition. Every system under control required oversight to remain so. Paranoia became policy. Surveillance expanded. Redundancy replaced trust. Decisions were centralized further, not out of greed, but out of fear of losing control. The Sith did not relax after victory. They tightened. The Jedi were gone, but their absence did not bring relief. It brought uncertainty. Without a visible enemy, the Sith lost the clarity that struggle once provided. Power without opposition felt directionless, even hollow. They had prepared for conquest. They had not prepared for emptiness. Old Sith lords had dreamed of this moment as fulfillment. They believed ruling the galaxy would quiet the hunger that drove them. Instead, hunger remained, transformed into anxiety over maintaining what had been taken. The Sith ruled, but they did not belong. They could not walk among those they governed. They could not trust admiration. They could not share burdens. And every relationship was defined by hierarchy. Every interaction carried calculation. The dark side fed on fear, but fear never fed back. Isolation deepened. The Sith discovered that absolute power removed mirrors. There were no equals to challenge them honestly. No voices to question decisions without threat. Even dissent became suspect, punished before it could form. Victory narrowed perspective. The galaxy appeared stable on the surface. Trade flowed, wars ended, systems complied. But beneath that stability, tension accumulated. Fear did not resolve conflict. It suspended it. The Sith felt this suspension acutely. They had become caretakers of a balance built on intimidation. Every moment of calm required effort. Every sign of unrest demanded response. Control was endless work. Victory felt empty because it offered no closure, no endpoint, no release. The Sith stood at the height of power and realized something too late. Domination solved external threats, but it did nothing to quiet the internal void that had driven them for centuries. They had won the galaxy, but they had not found peace within themselves, and that emptiness would shape everything that followed. Watching began the true labor of the Empire. Ruling was easy, Maintaining obedience was not. The Sith learned quickly that fear fades when it is not refreshed. Compliance decays when it is not monitored. An empire built on intimidation must never look away. And because the moment attention drifts, ambition begins to grow in the shadows. So the empire watched. Systems were catalogued, populations measured, movements tracked. Not because rebellion was constant, but because it was inevitable. The Sith did not believe in loyalty. They believed in incentives, pressure, and consequence. Every governor was observed. Every commander was reviewed. Every official was replaceable. Surveillance became routine, justified as security. As citizens were told, it protected them from chaos, from enemies that no longer truly existed. Most accepted this explanation willingly. Safety felt real. Freedom felt abstract. The Sith encouraged this trade. Information flowed upward constantly. Reports were filed, analyzed, cross-checked. Patterns were studied obsessively. A change in production, a delay in tribute, a rise in local influence. Nothing was too small to be noticed. Control depended on anticipation. And the Sith did not wait for threats to form. They removed potential threats before they understood themselves as such. Promotions were denied, transfers arranged, accidents engineered quietly. Rebellion was strangled before it learned to breathe. This was not cruelty. It was maintenance. The Sith trusted no one because trust required vulnerability. Vulnerability invited loss. Watching eliminated uncertainty, and uncertainty was the greatest danger of all. The dark side thrived in this environment, sure, but it demanded constant input. Fear had to be renewed. Examples had to be made. Order had to be enforced visibly enough to be remembered, but not so violently that it inspired unity against it. The Sith calculated this balance carefully. Punishments were precise. Public enough to be understood, limited enough to avoid martyrdom. The goal was not rage, it was compliance reinforced by inevitability. The Jedi would have called this oppression. The Sith called it stability. An endless watching reshaped the Empire's leadership. Governors stopped innovating. Creativity became risk. Initiative felt dangerous. Obedience was rewarded more consistently than success. Over time, the empire filled with officials who survived by avoiding notice rather than achieving excellence. The Sith noticed this decay. They accepted it. Efficiency mattered less than control. A stagnant system was preferable to an unpredictable one. Progress could be managed, surprise could not. The Emperor, and at the center of this vast network, felt the strain most acutely. Every report passed through layers of analysis, yet responsibility always returned upward. Ultimate authority meant ultimate burden. There was no rest. Watching never ended. Even moments of quiet were suspect. Calm could hide conspiracy. Peace could mask preparation. The Sith learned to distrust stability itself, because stability could precede collapse if not monitored closely. Sleep became shallow, and meditation grew sharp and restless. The dark side no longer whispered promises. It demanded attention. The Empire functioned, but it did not breathe. Fear froze motion. Surveillance flattened ambition. The galaxy obeyed, but it did not believe. Compliance replaced loyalty. Silence replaced hope. The Sith achieved control so complete that it began to consume its own foundations. Endless watching prevented rebellion, but it also prevented renewal. Everything became rigid, brittle, and dependent on constant pressure to hold its shape. The Sith sensed this fragility. They responded by watching more, because looking away was the one thing they could not afford to do. At the center of the empire, there was no throne room full of voices. There was silence. Power gathered upward, concentrating until it rested on a single will. Orders flowed outward in every direction, but nothing truly flowed back. Reports arrived, data accumulated. Fear was felt at a distance, yet none of it bridged the gap between ruler and ruled. Absolute power created absolute distance. The Sith had once believed solitude was strength. Independence meant freedom from betrayal. Distance meant safety. At the peak of the empire, they learned how wrong that belief had been. No one spoke honestly. Every advisor measured words carefully. Every official filtered truth through survival. Information arrived shaped by fear, softened to avoid punishment, sharpened to redirect blame. So reality bent before it reached the center. The Sith ruled alone. They had eliminated rivals, crushed enemies, silenced dissent. What remained were subordinates who obeyed without conviction. Loyalty was performed, not felt. Praise was offered as protection, not admiration. The dark side fed on isolation. It whispered caution constantly. It warned of plots that might exist. It magnified every anomaly, every deviation, every unexpected fluctuation. Without equals to challenge perception, as suspicion replaced clarity. The Sith trusted nothing except control. This isolation was not accidental. It was the cost of victory. To rule through fear meant ruling without companionship. Anyone close enough to matter was close enough to threaten. Distance became doctrine. The Sith could not share burdens. They could not express doubt. Doubt signaled weakness, and weakness invited challenge. Every decision had to appear certain, even when uncertainty dominated internally. The mask of authority could never be removed. The Emperor felt this weight constantly. Moments of reflection brought no comfort. Meditation revealed not peace, but endless vigilance. The Force no longer flowed freely. It pressed inward, heavy with expectation, demanding constant assertion of dominance to remain aligned. There was no room for rest. The Sith had once drawn strength from struggle. Opposition sharpened purpose. Resistance defined direction. Now, with enemies crushed and systems compliant, purpose blurred. What was power for once everything was owned? The galaxy existed as an abstraction. Numbers, systems, assets. Populations measured in compliance and productivity. The Sith no longer interacted with life directly. Everything passed through layers of control and reporting. This distance dulled perspective. Decisions were made efficiently, but without empathy. Not because the Sith lacked understanding, but because understanding created hesitation. Hesitation was dangerous, so it was removed deliberately. The Sith became a function. At the center of power, identity narrowed. The role consumed the self. Ruler replaced individual. Every thought was evaluated through the lens of control, security, permanence. Even ambition changed. There was nothing left to conquer externally. Expansion risked instability. Innovation risked loss. The Empire's size demanded preservation, not growth. And the Sith turned inward, seeking mastery over time, fate, and death itself. Isolation intensified. There was no one to share victory with, no one to confide regret, no one to confirm whether decisions were wise or merely effective. The Sith ruled over trillions and yet existed utterly alone. This solitude was not tragic, it was corrosive. Without challenge, power stagnated. Without trust, authority hollowed. The Sith sensed this decay but could not reverse it. And any attempt to loosen control risked collapse. Any attempt to connect risked vulnerability. So the Sith endured. They accepted isolation as the price of dominance. They believed history would justify them, that order mattered more than personal cost. The galaxy was stable. That had to be enough. But in the quiet at the center of everything, surrounded by obedience and fear, the Sith discovered the final consequence of absolute power. There was no one left to stand beside them, only below them, and everything had been taken, but nothing could be kept. The Sith ruled an empire that obeyed perfectly on the surface. Orders were followed, systems functioned. Opposition was rare and swiftly erased. By every measurable standard, the galaxy was under control. Yet control did not feel secure. Power, once seized, demanded constant defense. Every gain carried the weight of its own protection. Every quiet system needed watching. Every obedient official needed reassurance or replacement. Ownership created responsibility without relief. The Sith had won everything they had ever pursued, and still, the hunger remained. The old dream had promised fulfillment, that when the galaxy bent, the void inside would close. That domination would silence doubt, fear, and longing. Instead, victory revealed how temporary possession truly was. Nothing stayed conquered. Fear weakened with familiarity. Obedience required renewal. Loyalty never formed. The empire existed because it was enforced, as not because it was believed in. Remove pressure, and resistance would return. The Sith knew this. They had designed the system themselves. What they held was not devotion, but compliance. Not unity, but submission. The empire functioned, but it did not belong to them in any lasting sense. It had to be carried, sustained, corrected endlessly. The dark side fed them power, but it offered no rest. Every moment of stillness threatened decay. Every pause invited erosion. So the Sith learned that possession without trust was fragile, no matter how absolute it appeared. They had everything. They held nothing. The Jedi were gone, yet their absence left an unexpected void. The Sith had defined themselves in opposition for so long that victory removed a mirror they had relied on. Without an enemy to resist, purpose dulled. Without contrast, direction blurred. The empire became a machine, efficient, cold, self-consuming. The Sith stood at its center, no longer shaping history, but maintaining it. Innovation became risk. Change became threat. The future narrowed into endless repetition of control and correction. This was not the eternity they had envisioned. The rule of two had promised inevitability, not fulfillment. It ensured survival, not satisfaction. The Sith endured, but endurance was not peace. It was obligation without end. Somewhere beneath the layers of authority and fear, the Sith felt the truth pressing inward. And power could dominate others, but it could not resolve the emptiness that had driven them to seek it in the first place. They had mastered the galaxy. They had not mastered themselves. Everything they wanted lay before them, yet nothing eased the vigilance required to keep it. Victory demanded more effort than conquest ever had. Holding the empire became heavier than building it. The Sith recognized the pattern too late. Control without connection hollowed purpose. A fear without loyalty rotted foundations. Absolute power removed the very things that gave power meaning. The empire stood, but it was brittle. The Sith sensed that domination had reached its limit, that the structure they had built could not grow, only persist until strain or change shattered it. They had won the long game, And now there was nowhere left to go. Everything had been won. Nothing could truly be held. Echoes never truly fade in the Force. They settle, deepen, and wait. When the Sith fell from the height of their rule, the galaxy did not return to what it had been. Systems recovered, governments reformed, and new generations learned different names. Yet beneath renewal, impressions remained, etched into places and people alike. Worlds that had known occupation remembered it. Cities rebuilt over prisons still carried unease in their streets. Trade resumed, but trust moved slower. The Sith had ruled through fear and control, and fear does not vanish when authority collapses. It lingers, teaching caution long after danger is gone. The Force itself held memory, not events, but weight, suffering compressed into quiet pressure that sensitive minds felt without understanding. Jedi who returned after the Empire sensed resistance in meditation, like currents shaped by long-gone storms. Nothing screamed, everything pressed. These echoes shaped choices. Leaders centralized power more quickly than before. Institution built safeguards that hardened into habits. Emergency measures returned easily because history had proven how fragile order could be. The Sith were absent, yet their methods had taught the galaxy how to govern itself through caution. Even resistance carried echoes. Rebellions formed with discipline sharpened by past failure. Fighters trusted secrecy. Networks compartmentalized knowledge. So survival lessons learned under darkness endured under freedom. The Sith had intended this, whether consciously or not. Their greatest legacy was not control but influence. They demonstrated how fear could organize societies, how patience could outlast opposition, how silence could be more powerful than armies. The Jedi reflected on this quietly. They trained with humility, aware that victory did not erase consequence. Balance restored was not balance untouched. It required care, listening, and restraint shaped by memory. Some scars faded with time, others integrated into identity. Cultures adapted, traditions changed. The galaxy learned to live with its past rather than deny it. Echoes never demanded obedience. They offered reminders that power leaves residue, that choices shape futures beyond intention, that darkness, once endured, alters perception forever. The Sith were gone from the light, their voices silenced, their banners fallen. But what they had impressed upon the galaxy remained, not as threat, but as lesson carried forward, quietly, endlessly, through the Force itself, waiting, shaping futures yet unseen. Scars do not announce themselves as wounds. They reveal themselves as habits. Generations born after the Sith never saw their banners or felt their rule directly. Yet they inherited a galaxy shaped by it. Parents taught caution before hope. Governments favored security before trust. Their institutions remembered collapse, even when history books softened the details. These lessons passed quietly. Children learned which questions were dangerous. Citizens learned that stability mattered more than justice. Leaders learned that fear could be managed, redirected, and used without naming its source. None of this required Sith presence. The pattern sustained itself. Trauma reshaped culture. Worlds once punished for defiance prized obedience. A region spared devastation, distrusted central authority. Entire species carried collective memory of loss that influenced alliances and prejudice centuries later. The Sith were absent, but their impact traveled forward through behavior. The Force reflected this inheritance. Young sensitives felt anxiety without cause, caution without lesson. Some mistook it for weakness, others turned it into vigilance. Training adapted, emphasizing grounding and empathy. and acknowledging that the galaxy itself carried unresolved weight. Even hope was scarred. Victories were measured carefully, never assumed permanent. Celebrations were restrained. Trust was conditional. The belief that darkness could return shaped every plan for the future. The Sith had taught the galaxy that endings were temporary. Resistance movements understood this best. They built redundancies. They planned for betrayal. They expected loss. Freedom fighters, after the Empire, did not romanticize victory. They prepared for relapse because history had shown how easily order could be claimed by fear. The Jedi, too, changed. They listened more than they commanded. They taught accountability alongside serenity. They accepted that guardianship required awareness of consequence, not certainty of righteousness. The scars left by the Sith humbled them. Some scars healed into strength. Communities learned solidarity. Species learned empathy through shared suffering. Alliances formed not from idealism, but from understanding cost. Pain created connection where ignorance once ruled. Other scars remained tender. Distrust lingered in politics. Surveillance tempted leaders again and again. Emergency powers waited patiently for the next crisis. The galaxy survived, but it did not forget how easily it could fall. This inheritance defined an era, not ruled by Sith, but informed by them. Scars across generations did not demand despair alone. The galaxy did not return to innocence. It returned to awareness. After the Sith, survival no longer felt guaranteed. Peace became something to maintain rather than assume. Systems rebuilt with caution embedded into design. Power was distributed more carefully, yet always watched, always questioned. Nothing felt simple anymore. Trade resumed, but safeguards multiplied. Alliances formed with exit plans already written. Military forces shrank in name, but expanded in readiness. The galaxy learned that strength did not always announce itself until it was too late. The Jedi walked a changed path. They no longer believed balance meant absence of darkness. They understood balance required vigilance without dominance, humility without blindness. Training emphasized listening to the Force as it was, not as they wished it to be. Certainty was replaced by responsibility. The Force itself felt altered, not corrupted, but seasoned. It carried the memory of restraint and excess both, responding differently to those who touched it. Power came slower. Insight arrived with weight. Every action echoed longer. The galaxy matured through loss. Some worlds thrived, learning resilience from hardship. Others stagnated, fearful of repeating history. Progress became uneven, shaped by how deeply scars had settled. The Sith had not destroyed civilization. They had complicated it. Stories changed. Legends once celebrated heroes who struck decisively. Now they praised those who waited, who protected quietly, who understood cost. Victory was no longer the end of a story. It was the beginning of responsibility. The republic that followed was cautious. It debated endlessly, sometimes to its own detriment. Fear of centralization slowed reform. Memory of collapse haunted every proposal for change. This caution saved lives. It also limited vision, and the Sith had proven that patience could outlast strength. The galaxy responded by fearing patience as much as aggression. Every slow plan invited suspicion. Every quiet rise triggered concern. The shadow of the Sith distorted perception, not through control, but through memory. The galaxy was freer, yet heavier, safer, yet less trusting. It survived, but it did not forget how fragile survival truly was. This was the lasting alteration, not broken worlds or fallen orders, but a collective understanding that darkness did not need to win to leave permanent marks. It only needed time, intention, and opportunity. The Sith were gone. Their influence was not. And the galaxy moved forward carrying that truth into every decision, every alliance, every hope for the future. Changed forever, not by what it had lost, but by what it had learned. Darkness never needed to rule forever. It only needed to wait. The Sith were gone, scattered into history, and their names reduced to warnings and myths. Temples lay in ruin, orders dissolved, bloodlines faded. By every visible measure, the threat had ended. Yet the dark side did not disappear. It receded. The Force does not forget intent. It absorbs it, carries it forward, and releases it when conditions align. The Sith understood this better than anyone. Their greatest legacy was not empire or fear, but patience taught to the darkness itself. The galaxy believed endings were final. They were not. And every generation faced moments of fear, loss, and desperation. Every crisis tested restraint. Every choice carried the temptation to control rather than trust. The Sith no longer needed to whisper. The path they carved remained visible. The darkness waited in those moments. It waited in leaders who believed safety justified force, in institutions that valued order over compassion, in individuals who chose certainty instead of understanding. None of this required Sith guidance, yet it required memory. The Jedi accepted this truth quietly. They did not promise the end of darkness. They promised awareness. They taught that vigilance was not paranoia and peace was not passive. Balance required effort, renewed endlessly. The Force flowed onward, shaped by all that had come before. Darkness waited not as an enemy, but as a possibility, a reminder that power, once discovered, is never truly unknown again. That knowledge cannot be erased, only restrained. And the Sith had proven what patience could achieve. Others would remember. This did not mean doom was inevitable. It meant responsibility was permanent. The galaxy would always stand at the edge of choice, deciding whether fear or understanding guided the next step. The darkness waited, not plotting, not rushing, simply present. And so did the light. Neither vanished. Neither won forever. They existed in tension, shaped by history, memory, and the quiet decisions made when no one was watching. The Sith left no final victory. They left a warning that the greatest battles are not fought with armies, but with choices repeated across time. That darkness does not need to conquer to survive. It only needs to wait, and the galaxy, wiser and wounded, moved forward knowing that the shadow would always exist, not to rule, but to remind.